Welcome to Velvet Night Vellum. Before we begin, find your most comfortable position. Adjust your pillows, pull up the blanket, or perhaps turn on a fan for a gentle breeze. Now take a deep breath, close your eyes, and let the world fade away as we begin. There is a place on this earth where the sky first learned to remember. It is not marked by monuments you would recognise today, nor celebrated in the stories your schoolbooks carried. It exists now only in the slow drift of sand, in the weight of silence that settles over broken clay, in the faint shadows cast by reeds that grow along rivers older than language itself. This place is called Mesopotamia. The name means between the rivers. Two great currents, one called Tigris, the other Euphrates, run through a land that was once green and soft with life. They move slowly, as rivers do in flatlands, carrying silt and memory downstream, depositing both into the earth. The people who lived there, thousands of years before your time, learned to read the rivers. They learned to plant in the silt, to dig channels, to coax water into patterns that would feed them. And in the quiet hours when the work was done and the stars emerged, they learned to wonder. They called themselves the Sumerians. You may have heard that name before, perhaps in passing, perhaps in a museum corridor where the air smells faintly of dust and old stone. But you do not need to remember facts tonight. You do not need to hold on to dates or dynasties. Tonight, you are only asked to imagine a world where the night sky was not dimmed by cities, where the Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of its own, and where every flicker of light was a question waiting to be answered. The Sumerians looked up at that sky and saw faces, not stars, faces, beings, gods who walked among them once, or so the story said, gods who had shaped the first humans from clay, who had taught them to write, to build, to count the days. These gods had names that sound strange to you now. Anu, Enlil, Enki, Inanna. But the Sumerians also had another word, a word that gathered all these divine figures into a single breath, Anunnaki. It is a soft word, isn't it? It does not demand your attention, it does not shout. It simply rests there, like an ancient tablet half buried in sand, waiting for someone to brush the dust away. Tonight we will do exactly that. But we will do it slowly. We will not rush. We will not ask you to decide what is true or what is myth. And we will only ask you to listen, to let the story unfold like the slow turn of a river, and to wonder, as the Sumerians once wondered, why beings who were once so present in the world became so thoroughly absent. The land between the rivers was not always silent. Once it hummed with life. Reeds whispered in the marshes, goats bleated in the fields, children played near irrigation ditches, their laughter mingling with the calls of cranes overhead. And in the centres of the cities, Uruk, Eridu, there rose great temples called ziggurats, step pyramids of mud bricks that climbed toward the sky. These were not temples as you might imagine them. They were not places of quiet prayer. They were houses. The Sumerians believed the gods lived there, in the uppermost chambers, and so they brought offerings, barley, dates, and beer brewed from grain, small clay figurines of animals. The priests climbed the steep stairs each morning and evening, carrying these gifts, hoping the gods would notice, hoping the gods would stay. Because the gods, it was said, had once walked the earth freely, not as spirits, not as distant forces, as beings with weight and presence, who left footprints in the mud, who spoke in voices you could hear. The oldest Sumerian texts, pressed into clay with wedge-shaped reeds, the very first writing humanity ever made, speak of a time when the Anunnaki lived among humans, when they governed the cities, when they made decisions about water and war and harvest, and then slowly they withdrew. Not all at once, not in a single cataclysm, but gradually like a tide pulling back from shore. The gods became distant, but they stopped appearing in the streets. They stopped speaking directly to kings. The temples remained, the rituals continued, but something had shifted. The presence that once filled the land had faded into absence. The Sumerians noticed. They wrote about it in their own way. They composed hymns that mourned the silence of the gods. They recorded king lists that stretched back impossibly far, to a time before the flood, when rulers reigned for thousands of years, and the Anunnaki walked openly among them. They preserved stories of a great assembly, a council of gods who met to decide the fate of humanity, who argued and debated and sometimes disagreed. But nowhere in these texts do the Sumerians explain why the gods left. They only remembered that once, long ago, the world was different. Once the gods were here, and now they were not. Tonight we are not here to solve that mystery. We are not here to argue about ancient astronauts or forgotten civilizations or hidden knowledge. Those debates belong to daylight, to voices raised in certainty. Here, in the quiet dark, we are only here to remember, to sit with the question as the Sumerians did, without rushing toward an answer. Because sometimes the most beautiful part of a story is not knowing how it ends. The Anunnaki, in the Sumerian imagination, were not villains. They were not tyrants who enslaved humanity, nor were they benevolent saviours who lifted us from ignorance. They were something more complicated, more human, even in their divinity. They argued. They made mistakes. They loved and mourned and grew tired. They were gods, yes, but gods who carried the weight of existence the way you carry the weight of a long day. And perhaps that is why they left. Perhaps they simply grew weary. The texts do not say this outright, but you can feel it in the way the stories shift over time. In the earlier Sumerian hymns, the Anunnaki are vibrant, active, constantly intervening in human affairs. But as the centuries pass, as Sumer gives way to Akkad, as Akkad gives way to Babylon, the gods grow quieter. They recede into the heavens. They become symbols, distant and unreachable, like stars you can see but never touch. The people still prayed. The priests still climbed the ziggurats. But the gods no longer answered in the way they once had. And so the question remains, hanging in the air like dust caught in sunlight. Where did the Anunnaki go? Oh, not who were they? We will explore that soon enough. Not what did they want? That too will come. But simply, gently, the question that haunted the Sumerians themselves. Why did the gods, who once walked so closely beside us, choose to disappear? The night is long and the story is patient. Let your breathing slow. Let your body sink deeper into stillness. There is no urgency here. No need to hold on to every word. The ancient world will wait for you. The clay tablets, inscribed with forgotten names, will remain in the darkness, ready to be read when you are ready to listen. For now, let us simply rest in this knowledge. Once in the land between two rivers, beneath a sky crowded with stars, there lived a people who believed the gods had names, who believed the gods had once been present and then were gone, and who believed that memory, pressed into clay, preserved across millennia, was the only way to keep the divine from vanishing entirely. And so they wrote the names: Anu, the Sky Father; Enlil, the storm; Enki, the wise one who loved humanity; Inanna, the fierce and beautiful, who descended into the underworld and returned transformed. And beneath all these names, woven into every story, was the presence of the Anunnaki, the great gods, the ancient ones, the assembly who once decided the fate of the world. We will meet them soon, one by one, as the night unfolds. But for now, let us simply breathe in the silence of Mesopotamia. Let us imagine the wind moving across the plains, carrying the scent of river water and dry earth. Let us picture the ziggurats rising in the distance, their shadows long and soft in the fading light. Let us feel the coolness of clay tablets beneath our fingertips. Each one a doorway into a time before time was counted the way we count it now. The gods were here once, and then they were not. And in that absence, the Sumerians left as a gift the first written words, the first myths, the first questions that would echo across every civilization that followed. Tonight we follow those echoes back to their source, gently, slowly, without urgency. The way one walks through a desert at twilight, when the heat has passed and the stars are just beginning to appear. The way one listens to a story that has no ending, only the quiet promise of continuation. The Anunnaki are waiting, not in temples, not in ruins, but in the space between memory and forgetting, where all lost gods reside. Let us go there now. In the beginning there was no beginning, not as you understand it, not a spark, not a voice calling out across the void. The Sumerians did not imagine creation as a singular moment of divine will. They imagined it as separation, a slow, inevitable drawing apart of things that had always existed but had not yet found their place. There was sky, there was earth, there was water. But they were not yet distinct. They moved through one another, formless and unnamed, like breath mingling with darkness. The sky pressed down upon the earth floated upon the deep waters. The waters, dark and fathomless, held everything in suspension, neither rising nor falling, simply being. And within this undifferentiated cosmos there were beings, not gods yet, not in the way we think of them, but presences, or currents of awareness woven into the fabric of existence itself. The Sumerians called them by names that carried the weight of elemental forces. An, the sky; Ki, the earth; Absu, the deep. These were not metaphors. To the Sumerian mind, the sky was a god, and the god was the sky. There was no separation between the divine and the physical. The universe was alive, conscious, threaded through with intention and purpose. And from this living cosmos, the first order began to emerge. The sky lifted. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the great vault of heaven rose away from the surface of the earth. Between them, a space opened, a realm of air and light where time could begin to move, where things could grow and change and eventually die. This space was called Lil, the atmosphere, the breath of the world. And into this space, the Anunnaki descended. The word Anunnaki carries layers of meaning that no single translation can capture. Some say it means those who came from heaven to earth. Others translate it as princely offspring, or seed of the prince. But the Sumerians themselves used the term more fluidly, more poetically. The Anunnaki were the great gods. Yes, but they were also something older than godhood. They were the original order, the first division of cosmic responsibility. They were not conquerors. They were not invaders from distant stars, arriving to subjugate or exploit. That narrative belongs to modern imaginations, to stories shaped by our own fears of colonization and control. The ancient texts tell a different story. They describe the Anunnaki as administrators, as beings who took upon themselves the immense and exhausting work of keeping the cosmos in balance. The universe in Sumerian thought was not a machine that ran on its own. It was a living system that required constant attention, constant adjustment. The sun had to rise, the rivers had to flow, the seasons had to turn. None of this happened automatically. It happened because the gods willed it, because they performed the labour of maintaining creation, and that labour was divided among them. An, the Sky Father, held dominion over the heavens. His realm was distance and grandeur, the cold brilliance of stars that never set. He was remote as the sky is remote, but his authority was absolute. When the assembly of gods gathered to make decisions, it was An who presided, silent and vast as the dome of night. Enlil, his son, took the realm of air and storm. He was the breath between heaven and earth, the wind that moves across the plains, the voice that carries commands from the divine assembly to the world below. Enlil was not gentle. His storms could destroy cities, his floods could reshape the land. But he was necessary. Without him, the sky and earth would collapse back into one another, and the space where life could exist would vanish. Enki, the wise one, descended into the deep waters. He was the god of the Abzu, the subterranean ocean that lay beneath the earth, the source of all freshwater rivers and springs. Enki was a craftsman, a thinker, a god who loved puzzles and solutions. He shaped the first tools, the first spells, the first arts of civilization. And later, when humanity finally emerged, it was Enki who had become their greatest advocate, their protector against the harsher judgments of the other gods. But that time had not yet come, for now there was only the work. Imagine a world without humans, not empty, never empty. The earth was already full of life, in its own way. There were plants, perhaps, or the memory of plants. There were beasts that moved through the shadows, though the texts do not name them. There were spirits, minor gods, beings without the power or status of the Anunnaki, but still woven into the fabric of existence. And there was the work. The gods did not rest. They dug the great rivers, carving channels through the earth so that water could flow from the mountains to the sea. They raised the first hills, establishing boundaries so that the land would not dissolve back into the primordial waters. They set the moon in its course, marked the passage of days, taught the stars to move in patterns that could be read and remembered. It was exhausting. The texts do not shy away from this. They describe the younger gods, the lesser Anunnaki, labouring endlessly under the direction of the elder gods. They dug irrigation canals. They carried baskets of earth. They shaped the world with their hands, and their hands grew tired. This is important to understand. The Anunnaki were not omnipotent. They were powerful, yes, immensely so. But they were also finite. They could grow weary. They could feel the weight of eternity pressing down upon them. And in their weariness, they began to ask a question that would eventually change everything. Why must we do this work ourselves? The deep waters below the earth were dark and still. Enki lived there, in a palace built of lapis lazuli and silver, where the only light came from the faint glow of sacred stones embedded in the walls. He was alone often, which suited him. The other gods preferred the open sky, the mountain tops, the places where they could look down upon the world they were shaping. But Enki was drawn to depths, to the hidden currents that moved beneath the surface of things. He thought about creation differently than the others. An and Enlil saw the cosmos as a hierarchy, a structure of authority and command. The sky ruled the air ruled the earth contained the waters. Order flowed downward, from the highest to the lowest, and every being had its place within that order. But Enki saw something else. He saw connection. He saw how the waters fed the rivers, how the rivers fed the land, how the land fed the sky through rain and mist. He saw cycles, not hierarchies. He saw the universe as a web, each strand supporting the others, each god necessary not because of rank but because of function. And he began to wonder if there might be another way, a way to ease the burden, a way to share the work. The idea did not come to him all at once. It emerged slowly like water seeping through stone, gathering in hidden pools until it found a way to the surface. He watched the way clay held shape when moulded. He watched the way plants grew from seeds, carrying within them the pattern of what they would become. And he watched the minor gods, the ones without names or temples who performed their tasks without complaint because they knew no other existence. And he thought, what if we made something new? Not a god, not a spirit, but a being capable of labour, capable of learning, capable of taking upon itself the work that was wearing the Anunnaki down to silence. A being that could serve, but also And this was the part that made Enki different from the others. A being that could think, that could choose, that could in time become something more than it was made to be. He did not speak of this yet. The time was not right. The other gods were still committed to the old order, still convinced that the work of creation was theirs alone to bear. To suggest otherwise would be to challenge the very foundation of their existence. So Enki waited. He descended deeper into the Abzu, into chambers where even the other gods did not go, and he began to experiment. He shaped clay into forms, pressed his will into them, watched them crumble and dissolve. He whispered incantations, blending words with intention, trying to find the exact formula that would allow lifeless matter to hold consciousness. He failed, again and again. But he didn't stop, because Enki understood something the other gods had not yet grasped. The age of the Anunnaki was ending. Not because they would be destroyed, not because they would be overthrown, but because they would choose to step back, to withdraw, to pass the work of maintaining the world to something smaller, something less divine, something that could carry the burden without the weight of eternity pressing down upon it. Humanity was already stirring in Enki's mind, a dream not yet given form. But the dream was patient. It knew how to wait. Above, in the bright realm of air and storm, Enlil stood on the summit of a mountain that no longer exists. He looked down at the earth they had shaped, at the rivers carving their way to the sea, at the fields slowly greening under the sun they had set in motion. It was beautiful in its way. It was orderly. It was everything they had worked to create. But it was also empty. Not of life. There was life in forms too small or strange to name, but empty of purpose. The gods had built a stage, but there were no players. They had composed a song, but there was no one to sing it. Enlil did not think the way Enki thought. He didn't dream of sharing the work or easing the burden. To him, the labour of the gods was sacred, a duty that defined them. To give that labour away would be to diminish what they were, and yet, he too felt the weariness creeping in. He too noticed the younger gods growing slower, their movements less certain, their voices quieter in the assembly. He too wondered how long they could sustain this, how many more millennia they could carve rivers and raise mountains before something inside them broke. The wind moved around him, carrying no answers, only the scent of rain that had not yet fallen, and the distant sound of water meeting stone. In the assembly of the gods, decisions were made slowly. They didn't argue the way humans argue, with raised voices and sharp words. They spoke in the language of consensus, of gradual alignment, of silences that carried more weight than speech. An presided, but he didn't command. Enlil guided, but he didn't dictate. Even Enki, when he finally brought his proposal before the council, did not demand. He simply offered a solution, a possibility, a way forward. The gods listened. Some were curious, some were sceptical, some were too tired to care. But none of them said no, and so the work began. Not the work of shaping rivers or raising mountains, but the deeper, stranger work of shaping consciousness itself. The work of taking clay, simple, lifeless clay, and breathing into it something that could think, that could choose, that could carry forward the patterns the gods had established. The work of making humanity. But that story belongs to the next chapter. For now we rest here in the age before humans, in the time when the Anunnaki still walked the earth freely, when the cosmos was young and the work was endless, and the question of what would come next had only just begun to form. The gods are tired, the waters are deep, the sky is patient, and somewhere in the hidden chambers beneath the world, Enki is moulding the first human from clay, though he does not yet know if it will live. The age of the Anunnaki is ending, not with thunder, not with war, but with a whisper, a question, a possibility too fragile to name aloud. What if we were not alone? The answer is coming. Slowly, gently, like dawn breaking over the land between two rivers. There is a moment in every great story when the distant becomes near, when the gods who existed only in the high places, in the vault of heaven, in the realm of stars, choose to descend. Not because they must, but because something draws them downward. A need, a purpose, a sense that the work they have begun cannot be completed from a distance. The Sumerians remembered this moment. They did not record it as history, not in the way you might expect. There were no dates, no chronicles of arrival, no records of ships or journeys. Instead, they remembered its myth, as sacred pattern, as the way things had to be in order for the world to make sense. The Anunnaki came to Earth. Not all at once, not in a single descent. But gradually over ages that stretch longer than memory, they moved from the heavens into the physical world. They took upon themselves the weight of matter, the limitations of place. They became present in a way they hadn't been before, and the earth, which had been silent, began to hum with purpose. Why did they come? The texts offer no single answer, and perhaps that is fitting. The gods, like all beings of depth, acted from layered motives, from currents of intention that ran beneath the surface of any simple explanation. Some stories say they came for gold, not gold as you think of it, not wealth, not ornament, but gold as a substance of light, a material that carried the essence of the sun, that could be shaped and worked and used to maintain the structures of heaven itself. The texts speak of gold as something the gods needed, though they never explain quite why. It was a resource, yes, but also something more. A symbol of permanence, of incorruptibility, of the light that does not fade. Other stories say they came for the work itself, because the earth, left to its own devices, would remain formless. The rivers would overflow their banks. The seasons would lose their rhythm. The balance between sky and water, between heat and cold, between growth and decay, would collapse into chaos. The Anunnaki descended not to take, but to sustain, to hold the world in place, to ensure that the separation between heaven and earth, that first great act of creation, did not dissolve back into undifferentiated void. But there is a third possibility, one the texts do not state outright, but which whispers through every story of the gods walking among the land. They came because they were lonely, because the heavens, for all their grandeur, were empty. Because eternity, when spent in isolation, becomes its own kind of burden. Because even gods, perhaps especially gods, need something to care for, something to shape, something that depends upon them in order to exist. The earth gave them that. It gave them rivers to carve, mountains to raise, fields to green with grain. It gave them problems to solve, structures to build, patterns to perfect. It gave them, in short, a reason to continue. And so they descended. The first city was Eridu. You will not find it on any modern map. Its ruins lie buried beneath the sands of southern Iraq, near the edge of what was once the Persian Gulf. Archaeologists have uncovered fragments, broken pottery, foundation stones, the remnants of temples built and rebuilt over thousands of years. But the city the Sumerians remembered was something far older, something that existed before stone, before brick, perhaps even before human hands learned to shape either. Eridu was Enki's city. The texts say he built it himself or caused it to be built, raising it from the marshes where the Euphrates met the sea. It was not a grand city, not at first. It was a place of reeds and mud, of shallow water and soft ground. But Enki loved it. He loved the way the water moved through the land, the way the reeds whispered in the wind, the way the sun set over the marshes, in layers of gold and rose and deepening blue. He built a temple there, not for himself. Gods do not worship themselves, but as a dwelling a place where the boundary between the divine and the earthly could thin, where he could move freely between the deep waters of the Abzu and the surface world. The temple was small, a simple structure of woven reeds, but it marked the beginning of something new, a sacred geography, a way of organising the earth not according to natural features, but according to divine presence. The temple became a centre, a point around which meaning could gather. The land around it was no longer just land, it was Enki's land, it belonged to him, and he belonged to it. Other gods followed his example, and established his temple at Uruk, the city that would one day be ruled by Gilgamesh, though that time was still millennia away. His temple reached toward the sky, a structure of layered platforms that climbed higher and higher, each level smaller than the one below, until the topmost chamber touched the realm of heaven itself. Enlil chose Nippur, a city in the heart of Sumer, equidistant from north and south. His temple, called the Ekur, the mountain house, was the seat of divine authority. When the assembly of gods gathered to make decisions, they gathered there, in Enlil's temple, under his gaze. It was said that no law could be made, no king could be crowned, no war could be declared without Enlil's consent, spoken from the heights of the Ekur. Inanna, the goddess of love and war, claimed Uruk as well, sharing the city with An, but making it her own in ways that were fierce and unpredictable. Her temple was a place of celebration and violence, of ritual and passion, of boundaries crossed and then redrawn. And so the sacred cities rose, one by one, across the land between the rivers. Each god claimed a place. Each place became a centre, and the earth, which had been formless, began to take on structure, began to organise itself around these points of divine presence. The Anunnaki were no longer distant. They were here. The ziggurats came later, but they came from this same impulse, to build upward, to create a meeting place between heaven and earth, a structure that existed in both realms at once. The word ziggurat means to build high, and that is exactly what they did. They rose in steps, tier upon tier, each level painted a different colour, black for the earth, white for the clouds, red for the brick, blue for the sky, gold for the sun. At the top, a single chamber. This was the God's room. Not a throne room, not a hall of judgment, but something simpler. A bedroom in a sense. A place where the God could rest when they descended from the heavens, when they chose to dwell among the land rather than above it. The people, when people finally came, would climb the long staircases carrying offerings. Bread, beer, dates, honey, incense. They would leave these gifts in the chamber and then descend, never entering fully, never presuming to occupy the same space as the divine. The God would come later, in the quiet hours, and partake of what had been offered. Or so it was believed. Whether the gods truly came, whether they truly ate and drank and rested in those high chambers, the texts do not say. But the people believed, and belief in its way is a kind of presence. It holds space. It creates patterns. It allows the divine to remain real, even in the absence of proof. The ziggurats stood for thousands of years. Some crumbled, some were rebuilt, some were buried beneath the sands and forgotten, only to be uncovered by archaeologists who looked at the ruins and wondered what kind of people would build such things, and why. But in the age we are remembering now, in the time when the Anunnaki walked the earth, the ziggurats were not ruins. They were homes, they were thresholds, they were the places where heaven touched ground. Earth in this age was not yet a human realm. It was a working realm, a place where the gods laboured, where they shaped and sustained and struggled to maintain the balance they had established. The rivers still needed to be dug, the fields still needed to be irrigated, the boundaries between saltwater and freshwater, between fertile land and desert, between order and chaos still needed to be defended. And the work was hard. The texts speak of the lesser gods, the Igigi, who were tasked with the most difficult labour. They dug the canals, they carried the earth, they worked under the hot sun, their hands blistered, their backs bent, their voices growing quieter as the centuries passed. They were gods, yes, but they were also workers, and even gods can grow tired of work that never ends. The Igigi began to complain, not loudly, not at first, but in whispers, in glances exchanged when the elder gods were not watching. They spoke of the unfairness of it, the way the great Anunnaki, Enlil, Enki, made decisions from their temples while the Igigi laboured in the fields. They spoke of rest, of freedom, of a life that was more than endless toil. Enlil heard the whispers. He did not respond with mercy. Enlil was not cruel, but he was absolute. He believed in order, in hierarchy, in the necessity of work. The cosmos required maintenance. Someone had to do it. If the Igigi would not, then who? The question hung in the air, unanswered, until Enki, deep in the Abzu, began to shape the first clay. But we are not there yet. For now, we remain in the age of divine labour, in the time when the gods walked the earth not as visitors, but as inhabitants. They lived in the temples. They moved through the cities. They knew the scent of river water, the feel of sun on stone, the way the air cooled at dusk and warmed again at dawn. They were not distant. They were not abstract. They were present, physical, woven into the fabric of the world they had made. And perhaps this is why, when humanity finally emerged, the relationship between gods and humans was so intimate, so complicated. Because the gods had already lived as the humans would live. They had already known exhaustion, frustration, the weight of unending responsibility. They had already wondered if there might be another way. The earth was theirs, but it was also a burden. And burdens, even divine ones, eventually need to be shared. At night, when the work was done, the gods gathered, not always in the great assembly at Nippur, sometimes in smaller groups, in the courtyards of temples, in the cool chambers beneath the ziggurats. They spoke of what they had accomplished that day: a canal extended, a field irrigated, a boundary secured. They spoke of what still needed to be done, and sometimes they spoke of the future. Not prophecy, not prediction, but possibility, at the sense that the world they were building could not remain as it was forever, that something would have to change, something would have to give, in order for the work to continue. Enki said little during these conversations. He listened. He watched. He let the others speak their doubts and frustrations while he held his own thoughts close, like seeds waiting for the right season to be planted. He knew what was coming, not the details, not the exact shape of it, but the direction, the inevitability. Humanity was already stirring in the clay he had shaped, already dreaming in the incantations he had whispered. It was not yet alive, not yet conscious, but it was there, waiting for the moment when the gods would decide they could no longer do this work alone. That moment was approaching, slowly, gently, like water rising in the canals, like the sun climbing the sky at dawn. The Anunnaki had descended to earth. They had built their cities, raised their temples, carved their rivers through the land. But the earth was vast and the work was endless, and even gods cannot sustain everything forever. Something new was needed, something smaller, softer, more fragile, something that could carry the burden without breaking under the weight of eternity. The clay was ready, the incantations were complete, and in the darkness of the Abzu, Enki was preparing to breathe. There is a kind of tiredness that goes deeper than muscle, deeper than bone. It settles in the place where will resides, where the decision to continue is made each morning, each hour, each moment. It does not announce itself with pain or discomfort. It simply makes everything heavier. The shovel weighs more. The distance to the next field seems longer. The sun, which once felt warm and purposeful, becomes only heat, relentless, indifferent, pressing down. The Igigi knew this tiredness. They were gods, yes, lesser gods, younger gods, but gods nonetheless. They did not age as mortals age. They did not hunger or thirst in the way you do, but they could grow weary. They could feel the weight of eternity bearing down upon them, could feel the endless repetition of tasks that had no end, no completion, only continuation. And slowly, quietly they began to break. The work had always been hard. From the very beginning, when the Anunnaki first descended to Earth and began shaping the world into something that could sustain order, the labour had been immense. But in those early days, there had been purpose in it. There had been the satisfaction of creation, the joy of watching a river carve its first path through virgin land, the wonder of seeing green things emerge from soil that had never known life before. But that was long ago. Now the work was maintenance. The rivers had been dug, but they needed to be dredged. The canals had been carved, but they filled with silt and needed to be cleared. The fields had been planted, but they required irrigation, fertilization, constant attention to keep them from reverting to desert. The temples had been built, but their foundations settled, their walls cracked, their platforms eroded under the weight of rain and wind. Everything the gods had made required endless effort to sustain, and the Igigi bore the brunt of that effort. They were the workers, the labourers, the ones who carried baskets of earth on their shoulders, who wielded picks and shovels, who stood knee-deep in mud under the unforgiving sun. The great Anunnaki, Enlil, Enki, Inanna, planned and governed and decided. They sat in the cool chambers of their temples, or walked the high terraces of the ziggurats, or descended into the deep waters where the light was soft and the temperature never changed. But the Igigi worked, day after day, year after year, century after century. And no one asked them if they were tired. Imagine the feel of mud between your fingers, and not the pleasant coolness of damp earth in a garden, but the thick, heavy mud of the river banks, the kind that clings and weighs and refuses to be shaken free. The Igigi knew this mud intimately. It was under their nails, caked on their hands, smeared across their forearms. It dried in the sun and cracked, and they scraped it off only to plunge their hands back into the water and coat themselves again. They dug channels, miles and miles of channels, narrow and deep, carved through the flatlands between the Tigris and the Euphrates. These channels fed the fields, carried water to places where it would not naturally flow, allowed the earth to bloom with barley and wheat and date palms. Without the channels, there would be no harvest. Without the harvest, there would be no offerings to place in the temples. Without the offerings, the great gods would have nothing to sustain the rituals that held the cosmos in balance. So the Igigi dug. They started at dawn when the air was still cool and the light had not yet grown harsh. They worked with tools that were simple: bronze picks, wooden shovels, baskets woven from reeds. They moved in lines, one god lifting earth while another carried it away, a third smoothing the walls of the channel to keep them from collapsing. The work was repetitive: lift, carry, deposit, return, lift, carry, deposit, return. The rhythm became automatic, the body moving without thought, the mind drifting into a kind of emptiness that was not peace, but simply the absence of anything else. There was no room for reflection, no space for wonder. There was only the task, and the task after that, and the one after that, on stretching forward into infinity. By midday, the sun was at its height. The air shimmered with heat. The mud dried faster than they could work it, cracking at the edges of the channels, requiring them to add water, to smooth it again, to fight against the very elements they were trying to control. Sweat ran down their backs, though gods do not sweat the way mortals do. It was something else, an emanation of effort, a physical manifestation of exhaustion that even divinity could not entirely transcend. They did not speak much while they worked. There was nothing to say. Complaints would not change the task. Questions would not bring answers. The great gods had decided this work was necessary, and so it was necessary. The Igigi had no authority to refuse, no power to negotiate. And they were bound by the same cosmic order that held the sky above the earth, that kept the rivers flowing toward the sea. So they worked in silence. And the silence over time became a kind of language of its own. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when the work paused. Not because it was finished, it was never finished, but because even gods need to rest, need to let the muscles unclench, need to sit in the shade and let the heat drain slowly from their bodies. During these moments, the Igigi gathered in small groups. They sat on the banks of the canals they had dug, their feet dangling in the water, their backs against the reeds. They did not celebrate. They did not laugh or tell stories or sing the hymns that echoed through the temples above. They simply sat, breathing slowly, and staring at the horizon where the land met the sky in a haze of dust and light. Sometimes one of them would speak. "How much longer?" they would ask. No one answered. Because there was no answer. The work would continue as long as the earth needed to be sustained, as long as the great gods required the channels to flow, and the fields to produce and the temples to stand. There was no end point, no moment of completion, when they could lay down their tools and say, "It is finished." The work was eternal. And eternity, they were learning, was not a gift. It was a sentence. The resentment grew slowly, like silt accumulating at the bottom of a canal. At first it was barely noticeable. A hesitation before picking up the shovel. A glance exchanged between two workers that carried more weight than words. A subtle slowing of pace. You were not enough to draw attention, but enough to express what could not be said aloud. The Igigi did not rebel. Not yet. Rebellion was unthinkable. The cosmic order was absolute. The hierarchy was fixed. To challenge it would be to invite chaos, to risk the collapse of everything the gods had worked to build. And despite their exhaustion, despite their growing frustration, the Igigi still believed in the order. They still trusted that the great gods knew what they were doing, that there was a purpose to all of this, even if that purpose was hidden from them. But belief, when strained, becomes brittle, and the Igigi were being strained beyond what even gods could endure. They began to notice things they had not noticed before. The way Enlil walked through the fields without acknowledging them, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains, as if the workers were simply part of the landscape, no more worthy of attention than the reeds or the irrigation stones. The way An remained in his temple in Uruk, high above the city, never descending to see the work being done in his name, never touching the mud or feeling the heat or understanding what it meant to labour without end. The way Inanna passed through on her way to war or celebration, her energy fierce and bright, her laughter echoing through the air, while the Igigi stood silent in the fields, their hands blistered, their backs aching. Even Enki, who was kinder than the others, who sometimes paused to speak with the workers or offer a word of encouragement, even he did not truly understand. Because he didn't have to do the work, he could choose to labour if he wished. Oni could descend into the Abzu and shape things with his own hands. But it was always a choice. He could stop whenever he wanted. He could return to his palace, to his chambers of lapis, lazuli and silver, to the cool darkness where time moved differently, and exhaustion was only a concept, not a lived reality. The Igigi had no such choice, and slowly, quietly, they began to resent not just the work, but the ones who commanded it. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a group of beings who cannot speak their truth. It is not peaceful. It is not restful. It is a silence heavy with things unsaid, with anger that has no outlet, with despair that cannot be named. It presses down like the heat of the sun, like the weight of the baskets they carried, like the mud that clung to their hands no matter how many times they washed. The Igigi carried this silence with them everywhere. It was in their movements, the way they lifted the shovels with just a fraction less energy than before, the way they set down the baskets with just a touch more force. It was in their faces, the blankness that settled over their features, the absence of expression that was not calm but simply the erasure of all feeling, because feeling had become too dangerous. It was in the air between them, in the glances they exchanged, in the way they moved as one body, one collective exhaustion, one shared burden that had become too much to bear alone. The great gods didn't notice, or perhaps they noticed but didn't understand. It is easy to mistake silence for contentment when you do not want to see what the silence is hiding. It is easy to assume that work, once begun, will simply continue, because it has always continued, because there is no reason to think it would ever stop. But the Igigi were reaching a threshold. Not a breaking point, not yet, but something close. A place where the will to continue begins to falter, where the belief in the necessity of the work begins to crumble, where the question, why, starts to demand an answer that no one can provide. At night, when the work finally ceased, the Igigi did not return to temples. They had no temples. They were not worshipped. They had no offerings, no hymns, no rituals performed in their honour. They were simply workers, and workers do not need temples. They slept in the fields, on or along the banks of the canals, or in the shadow of the ziggurats that had been built for other gods. They lay on the hard earth, their bodies too tired to seek comfort, their minds too numb to dream. Above them, the stars moved in their ancient patterns, the same stars the great gods had set in motion, the same stars that mark the passage of time, the turning of seasons, the rhythm of the cosmos. The Igigi stared up at them sometimes, in those moments before sleep claimed them, and wondered if the stars ever grew tired, if the moon ever wished to stop its cycle, if the sun ever longed to rest instead of rising again, day after day, with no end in sight. They did not speak these thoughts aloud, but they thought them, and thoughts, when shared in silence by many minds, begin to take on a weight of their own, and they begin to accumulate, like the silt in the canals, like the dust on the fields. They begin to form into something that is not yet action, but is no longer merely resignation. Something was shifting, slowly, quietly, beneath the surface of the order the great gods had established. The Igigi were still working. The channels were still being dug, the fields were still being irrigated, the temples were still standing, but the silence was growing heavier. And in the darkness of the Abzu, Enki was beginning to sense it. Enki did not oversee the Igigi directly. That was Enlil's domain. Enlil was the one who organised the labour, who assigned the tasks, who ensured that the work continued without interruption. But Enki was perceptive in ways the other gods were not. He noticed patterns, he sensed currents beneath the surface. He understood that systems, even divine systems, could only be strained so far before something had to give. He watched the Igigi when they came to the rivers to drink, when they paused at the edges of the canals they had dug. He saw the way their movements had changed, the way the light in their eyes had dimmed. He heard the silence that followed them like a shadow. And he knew, not the specifics, not yet, but he knew that the current order could not hold. The earth required too much. The work was too vast. The Igigi, for all their strength, were finite. They could not sustain this forever. Something had to change, and change in Enki's mind meant creation, meant finding a new solution, a new way to distribute the burden, a new being that could take upon itself the labour that was grinding the Igigi down to silence. On he returned to his experiments. The clay, the incantations, the careful shaping of matter into something that could hold consciousness, that could learn, that could work without the burden of eternity weighing it down. He was close. Not finished, but close. And above, in the fields and canals, the Igigi continued their labour, unaware that their exhaustion was about to birth something entirely new. The sun set, the stars emerged, the rivers flowed, and in the silence of divine exhaustion, the first seeds of humanity were beginning to take root. There comes a moment in every act of creation when possibility becomes form, when the idea that has lived only in the mind, only in the realm of potential, crosses over into the physical world and becomes something that can be touched, that can breathe, that can exist independently of the one who imagined it. For Enki, that moment came in the deepest chamber of the Abzu, in a place where even the other gods rarely ventured, where the water was so still it seemed like glass, where the only sound was the faint drip of moisture from the ceiling and the slow, rhythmic pulse of his own divine heartbeat. He knelt beside a pool of clay, not ordinary clay. He had gathered it carefully over many cycles of the moon, from the banks of the Euphrates where the river met the marshes, from the place where fresh water and salt water mingled, where earth and water existed in perfect balance. He had sifted it, removing stones and roots until only the finest particles remained, soft, smooth, cool to the touch. It lay before him now, shaped into a rough form. Arms, legs, a torso, a head. It looked almost like a god in miniature, almost like the Igigi who laboured in the fields above. But it was smaller, more delicate. Its limbs were thinner, its frame less imposing. It was made to work, yes, but also to be worked upon, to be shaped by the world, to learn from the earth, to grow and change in ways that gods could not. Enki studied it in silence. The form was correct. He had refined it through countless attempts, adjusting proportions, testing structures, ensuring that the clay would hold together, that the limbs would support movement, that the shape would allow for the tasks he envisioned. But form alone was not enough. Clay, no matter how carefully shaped, remained clay. It needed something more. In the upper world, in the assembly of the gods at Nippur, a decision had been made. It had not come easily. The great Anunnaki did not make choices lightly, did not alter the cosmic order without long deliberation, without weighing consequences, without ensuring that what they were about to do would not unravel everything they had built. But the Igigi could not continue as they were. Even Enlil, stern and unyielding as he was, had seen the signs. The slowing of work, the silence that hung over the fields like fog, the sense that something somewhere was about to break. He did not understand exhaustion the way the Igigi experienced it, but he understood systems, and he understood that when a structure is strained beyond its capacity, it fails. And he did not wish to see the cosmic order fail. So when Enki proposed his solution, a new kind of being, one that could share the burden of labour without requiring the divine resources that sustain the Igigi, the assembly listened. There were objections, of course. Anne, remote and cautious, questioned whether such a being could be trusted, whether it would remain obedient, whether it would understand its place within the hierarchy, whether it might one day grow beyond the purpose for which it was made. Inanna wondered aloud if this new creation would be beautiful, if it would sing, if it would celebrate, if it would offer worship not out of duty but out of genuine love. But Enki spoke with quiet certainty. They will be small, he said. They will be fragile, they will live only a short time, measured against the span of our existence. But they will be enough. They will carry the burden we can no longer bear, and in return, we will teach them. We will guide them. We will give them knowledge, purpose, a place within the order we have made. The assembly considered, and in the end, they agreed. Not because the solution was perfect, but because it was necessary. The Igigi could not continue. The work could not stop. Something new had to be made. And so Enki received permission to proceed, to take clay and breath and the essence of divinity itself, and from these elements to shape the first humans. Enki returned to the Abzu with a small vial, It was made of alabaster, smooth and pale, sealed with wax. Inside was blood. Not his own. He had offered, but the assembly had decided otherwise. The blood came from a god who had volunteered, one of the lesser Anunnaki, a being whose name the texts do not always remember, but whose sacrifice would be woven into every human who ever lived. The god had been ritually slain. Not in violence, not in punishment, but in sacred purpose. They had sat quietly in the centre of the assembly, had closed their eyes, had allowed the knife to open their veins. Their blood had poured into bowls, dark and luminous, carrying within it the essence of divine consciousness, the ability to think, to choose, to understand. This was the gift that would separate humanity from mere clay. This was what would allow them to be more than tools, more than objects moved by external forces. They would carry within them a fragment of the divine, a spark, a trace of the same awareness that moved through the gods themselves. Enki opened the vial. The scent that rose from it was strange, metallic and sweet at once, like copper and honey mixed together. He poured the blood slowly over the clay form he had shaped, watching as it soaked into the surface, darkening the pale earth, seeping into the cracks and crevices, binding the particles together in a way that water alone could not. He worked the blood into the clay with his hands. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost tender. He pressed and kneaded, feeling the texture change beneath his fingers, feeling the clay transform from something inert into something that held potential, that trembled on the edge of becoming. The chamber was silent except for the sound of his breathing. And then, when the blood had been fully incorporated, and when the clay had taken on a darker, richer hue, Enki leaned close. He placed his mouth near the clay face, and he breathed. The breath of a god is not like your breath. It does not carry only air. It carries intention. It carries will. It carries the force that animates, that transforms, that pulls consciousness out of the void and anchors it in matter. Enki's breath flowed into the clay form. It entered through the mouth he had shaped, travelled down into the hollow chest, filled the space where lungs would be, where a heart would beat, where life would take root and begin its long, fragile journey. For a moment nothing happened. The clay lay still. The chamber remained silent. The water of the Abzu did not stir. And then, a sound, soft, almost inaudible. A faint intake of breath that did not come from Enki. The chest of the clay form rose, just slightly, just enough to show that something had changed, that the boundary between object and being had been crossed. Enki stepped back. He watched, waiting, his own breath held in anticipation. The clay form's chest rose again. Fell, rose, fell, a rhythm establishing itself. The first rhythm, the pattern that would sustain every human who ever lived. Breath in, breath out. The exchange between inner and outer, between self and world, between life and the constant possibility of its ending. The fingers twitched, small movements, uncertain, as if testing the limits of what was possible. The eyelids fluttered but did not open. Not yet. The body was learning itself, learning how to inhabit the form it had been given, how to translate divine intention into physical action. And Enki knelt beside the first human. He placed his hand on the clay chest, feeling the warmth beginning to gather there, feeling the slow, steady pulse of a heartbeat that had not existed moments before. "You are Awilu," he whispered. "Human, made from earth and water, blood and breath. You are small and you are fragile, and you will not live forever. But you will live. And in living you will serve a purpose greater than yourself. You will tend the fields. You will dig the canals. You will maintain the balance that the gods have made, and in return you will be cared for. You will be taught. You will be remembered." The clay figure did not respond. It could not yet understand language. It could barely understand existence. But somewhere deep within the blood-soaked clay, within the breath that now moved of its own accord, an awareness was beginning to bloom, faint, fragile, but undeniably present. Enki didn't make just one. The texts differ on the exact number, on whether he shaped them individually or spoke a word that caused them to multiply. But the essence is the same. Humanity did not begin with a single being, but with a group, a small community of clay-born creatures who would learn together, work together, grow together into something resembling a people. He shaped them carefully, each one unique, some taller, some shorter, some broader, some more slender. He gave them different features, different proportions, understanding that diversity would make them stronger, that a single template repeated endlessly would be brittle, inflexible, unable to adapt to the changing needs of the earth. Each one received the same elements: honey clay from the riverbanks, blood from the sacrificed god, breath from Enki's own lungs. And one by one they came to life, not all at once, not in a sudden awakening, but slowly, like dawn spreading across the land, like flowers opening to the sun. Their chests began to rise and fall, their fingers began to move. Their eyes, still closed, began to shift beneath the lids as if dreaming, as if seeing things that existed only in the realm between clay and consciousness. Enki sat among them as they woke. He did not rush them. He did not demand that they stand, that they speak, that they immediately begin the work for which they had been made. He simply waited, allowing them to discover their bodies, to learn the sensation of breath, the weight of limbs, the texture of the ground beneath them. One of them opened their eyes, made the first human to see the world. Their gaze was unfocused at first, confused, overwhelmed by the sudden flood of light and shadow and form. But slowly, their vision cleared. They looked at their hands, turning them over, studying the lines in the clay-turned flesh. They looked at the others lying nearby, beginning to stir. They looked at Enki, towering above them, his form radiant in the dim light of the Abzu. And they did not speak, because they did not yet have words, but their eyes held a question. "What am I?" Enki smiled. "You are the answer," he said softly, "to a question the gods have been asking for longer than you can imagine. You are the bridge between divine will and earthly need. You are the keepers of balance, and you are, in your own small way, sacred." The first humans learned quickly, but Enki taught them himself, leading them up from the darkness of the Abzu into the light of the upper world. He showed them the rivers, the fields, the canals that the Igigi had dug. He placed tools in their hands, simple at first, carved from wood and stone, and demonstrated how to use them. They watched, they imitated, they learned. Their movements were clumsy at first, uncertain. They didn't have the strength of the Igigi, the endurance of gods. They tired easily. They needed to rest, to eat, to drink. They were limited in ways the gods were not. But they were also willing. They did not resent the work. They did not carry the weight of centuries of exhaustion. To them the work was new. It was purpose. It was the reason they existed. And so they took to it with a kind of innocent dedication that the gods had long forgotten. And the Igigi watched from a distance, at first with suspicion, then with curiosity, and finally with something close to relief, because the burden, at last, was being shared. The humans dug alongside them, smaller shovels, lighter baskets, but the same task, the same rhythm: lift, carry, deposit, return. And slowly, gradually, the Igigi began to step back, not all at once, not abandoning the work entirely, but easing their pace, taking longer rests, allowing the humans to carry more of the load. The silence that had hung over the fields began to lift, not into celebration, not yet, but into something quieter, softer, a sense that the crisis had passed, that the breaking point had been avoided, that the cosmic order would hold, at least for now. At night, the first humans slept under the stars. They had no temples, no homes, only the open sky and the soft earth beneath them. They lay close together, instinctively seeking warmth, seeking the comfort of shared presence. And above them, the gods watched, not with ownership, not with domination, but with something gentler, something that might, in time, be called care. The humans were small. They were fragile. They would not live long. Decades, perhaps, measured against the millennia of divine existence. But they were enough. They were the solution. And in the cool darkness of the Abzu, Enki closed his eyes and allowed himself for the first time in ages to rest. The work would continue. But now it would be shared. And in that sharing, both gods and humans would find, however briefly, a kind of peace. There was a time when the world knew peace. Not the peace of emptiness, not the silence of abandonment, but the deep, sustaining peace that comes when everything exists in its proper place. When the rhythms of life align with the rhythms of the cosmos. When the divine and the earthly move together, like two rivers flowing side by side toward the same distant sea. The Sumerians called this time the Age of the Me. The word is difficult to translate. It means more than law, more than custom, more than knowledge. It means the sacred patterns that underlie all existence, the way things ought to be, the order that allows chaos to be held at bay, the invisible architecture that supports the visible world. In this golden age, the Me were not hidden. They were taught, shared, are passed from the hands of gods into the hands of humans like precious seeds planted in fertile soil. And under the careful tending of divine guidance, humanity began to bloom. The first generations of humans did not know loneliness. They woke each morning to the presence of the gods walking among them. Not distant, not abstract, but there, moving through the streets of the cities, standing in the doorways of temples, sitting beside the canals as the sun rose and the cool air began to warm. Enki came often to the fields. He walked between the rows of barley, his robes trailing in the dust, his eyes watchful and kind. He stopped to speak with the farmers, to show them how to read the soil, how to know when the earth was ready for planting, how to recognize the subtle signs that indicated drought or flood or pestilence approaching. When the humans listened with an attention that bordered on reverence, not because they feared him, though they did, in the way all small things fear that which is greater than themselves, but because they trusted him, because he had made them, had breathed life into their clay bodies, had given them purpose and place. When Enki spoke, his words carried the weight of creation itself. "See how the earth darkens here," he would say, kneeling to press his fingers into the soil. "This means the water has penetrated deeply. You can plant now, and the seeds will take root. But there," he gestured to a patch that looked identical to human eyes. "There the ground is still too dry. Wait 3 more days. Let the river bring another cycle of moisture before you sow." The farmers nodded, memorizing every word, every gesture. And when the harvest came, golden and abundant, they brought the first sheaves to Enki's temple and laid them at the feet of his statue, their hearts full of gratitude for the knowledge he had given them. Inanna taught them celebration. She appeared in the city of Uruk during the festivals, dressed in robes that shimmered like starlight, her hair adorned with flowers and precious stones. She danced in the streets and the humans danced with her, their movements tentative at first, then growing bolder as they learned the steps, as they felt the rhythm move through their bodies like a current of joy. She taught them songs, hymns that praised the turning of the seasons, the rising of the moon, the beauty of the earth in bloom. She taught them how to weave garlands, how to brew beer from barley and dates, and how to prepare feasts that honoured both the gods and the bonds between humans themselves. The festivals became the highlights of the year, moments when work ceased, when the fields were left fallow for a day or a week, when the entire city gathered in the temple courtyards to eat and drink and sing. The gods joined them, not as rulers presiding from on high, but as participants, as beings who delighted in the same pleasures, the taste of fresh bread, the coolness of beer, the sound of laughter echoing off stone walls. During these festivals, the boundary between divine and mortal seemed almost to dissolve. The gods sat beside humans at long tables. They listened to the stories the humans told, stories that were beginning to accumulate. Tales of the first planting, or of the child who wandered too far from the city and was guided home by a kind stranger who might have been Enki in disguise, of the woman who dreamed of Inanna and woke to find a flower growing in her courtyard that had never grown there before. The humans were learning to remember, to preserve their experiences in narrative, to pass knowledge from one generation to the next, not through divine instruction, but through their own voices, their own words. And the gods encouraged this. They knew that memory was sacred, that stories were a kind of immortality, that even small, fragile beings could touch eternity if they learned to carry the past forward into the future. Nisaba, the goddess of writing, gave humanity its greatest gift. She appeared in the temple at Uruk one morning, from carrying a reed stylus and a flat tablet of soft clay. The scribes, humans chosen for their patience, their steady hands, their ability to sit still for hours, gathered around her in silence. "Watch," she said. She pressed the stylus into the clay, making a wedge-shaped mark. Then another, then another. The marks meant nothing on their own, but when arranged in patterns they began to signify. This mark meant barley. This one meant sheep. This combination meant 10 sheep given to the temple. The scribes watched, their eyes wide. Nisaba handed the stylus to one of them. "Now you." The scribe's hand trembled as they took the tool. They pressed it into the clay, trying to replicate the marks Nisaba had made. The first attempt was clumsy, the wedges uneven. But Nisaba did not criticize. She simply guided their hand, showing them the angle, the pressure, the rhythm. "Again," she said gently. They tried again, and again. And slowly the marks began to take shape, began to resemble the patterns Nisaba had demonstrated. By the end of the day, the scribe had written their first word, barley. It seemed like such a small thing, a few marks on a piece of clay. But Nisaba smiled as if they had accomplished something miraculous. "You have captured a thought," she said. "You have taken what exists only in the mind and given it form in the world. This clay will dry. It will harden. And long after you are gone, long after I have withdrawn from this place, someone will find this tablet and know what you meant. They will read the word barley and understand." The scribe stared at the tablet, at the marks they had made, and felt something shift inside them. A sense of power, yes, but also responsibility, the knowledge that words once written could not be unspoken. That memory, once preserved, became a kind of truth that would outlast the flesh. Writing spread quickly after that, from temple to temple, from city to city. The scribes learned to record not just inventories and offerings, but stories, hymns, king lists, accounts of floods and droughts and victories. The clay tablets accumulated, were stored in libraries, became the foundation of a culture that would endure for thousands of years. And all of it began with Nisaba, a goddess sitting beside a human, teaching them to press a reed into clay. The cities flourished under divine presence. Uruk grew tall and prosperous, its walls strong, its granaries full. The great ziggurat at its centre rose higher and higher, each generation adding another level, another platform, reaching always toward the sky where An dwelt. Eridu remained Enki's sanctuary, a place of quiet wisdom nestled in the marshes, where scholars came to study the mysteries of water and earth, where healers learned to brew medicines from plants, where astronomers mapped the movements of stars. Nippur, the city of Enlil, became the political heart of Sumer. Kings came there to be crowned, to receive the blessing of the storm god, to affirm their right to rule. The Akur, the mountain house, stood at the centre of the city, its shadow long and solemn, a reminder that all authority flowed from the divine assembly that met within its walls. The humans built these cities with their own hands, yes, but they built them according to divine plans, following the sacred geometry the gods had revealed. Every street was aligned with the cardinal directions. Every temple faced the rising sun. Every canal followed the path Enki had traced in the earth. Order was visible everywhere, in the neat rows of barley in the fields, in the symmetry of the city gates, in the way the markets operated. Merchants weighing grain on scales blessed by Nisaba, transactions recorded on tablets that would be checked and verified by temple officials. There was no chaos here, no randomness. Everything had its place, its purpose, its connection to the cosmic patterns that held the universe in balance. And the humans felt safe. Safe in a way that is difficult to imagine now, in a world where the gods are silent, where uncertainty is the only constant. But in that golden age, the humans knew that they were watched over, that they were cared for, that the gods would not allow the world to fall into ruin. When storms came, Enlil tempered them. When droughts threatened, Enki opened the springs beneath the earth. When illness spread, Ninurta, the god of healing, taught the physicians which herbs to gather, which prayers to speak. The humans were not independent. They were not free in the way you might understand freedom. But they were held, supported, guided. And for a time, that was enough. The festivals marked the turning of the year. In spring, when the barley was planted, the city of Uruk held the sacred marriage, a ritual in which the king and a priestess of Inanna reenacted the union of heaven and earth, ensuring the fertility of the land. And the entire city gathered to witness, to sing hymns, to offer prayers that the seeds would take root, that the rains would come, that the harvest would be bountiful. In summer, when the heat was at its peak, offerings were made to Utu, the sun god, asking him to temper his rays, to allow the workers in the fields to labour without collapsing from exhaustion. In autumn, when the harvest came, the granaries were opened and the people feasted. They ate bread still warm from the ovens, drank beer sweetened with dates, shared meat roasted over open fires. And in the midst of the celebration, they set aside portions for the gods, the first and best of everything, placed on altars in the temples, offered with gratitude and reverence. In winter, when the work slowed and the days grew short, the people gathered in the temples to hear the stories that the scribes read from the tablets, recounting the old tales, the separation of heaven and earth, the descent of the Anunnaki, the creation of humanity. And the listeners sat in the warm glow of oil lamps, their bellies full, their bodies resting, and felt themselves part of something vast and ancient and enduring. The rhythm of the seasons became the rhythm of their lives, planting, growing, harvesting, resting, and within that rhythm there was peace. The children born in this age grew up knowing the gods as one might know beloved elders. They saw Inanna in the streets during festivals, her laughter bright and infectious. They saw Enki by the canals, his hands still muddy from demonstrating a new irrigation technique. They saw Nisaba in the scribal schools, her patience infinite as she corrected their tablet exercises over and over until the marks were perfect. The children were not afraid. They approached the gods with questions, with offerings of flowers or small clay figurines they had made. And the gods, more often than not, stopped to listen, to answer, to accept the gifts with a kindness that made the children feel seen, valued, loved. This was the world humanity was born into. Not a world of struggle, not a world of abandonment. but a world of order and abundance and presence. A world where the divine was not distant or abstract, but woven into the fabric of daily life, as real as the sun and the river and the bread that sustained them. It was a golden age, and like all golden ages, it could not last forever. But for now, for this moment suspended in time, for this brief window when gods and humans walked side by side, it was perfect. The fields were green, the cities were strong, the temples were filled with song, and at night when the humans lay down to sleep, they did so without fear, because they knew that the gods were watching, that the cosmic order was intact, that tomorrow would come, and it would be good. The Anunnaki stood on the terraces of their temples, looking out over the cities they had helped to build, and they felt something they had not felt in ages. Not pride exactly, not satisfaction, but a quiet sense of rightness, a sense that the burden they had carried for so long was finally being shared, that the work of maintaining the world was no longer theirs alone. Humanity was young, fragile, imperfect, but humanity was also willing, capable, learning, and in time perhaps they would be able to sustain the world on their own. The gods didn't speak this thought aloud, but it moved through them like a current, like the wind across the plains, like water finding its level. The age of the Anunnaki was drawing to a close, not in violence, not in cataclysm, but in gentle, inevitable transition. The humans were ready to carry the world forward, and the gods, at long last, were ready to let them. But the moment had not yet arrived, for now the golden age continued. The sun rose and set, the rivers flowed, the harvest came. And in the space between divine and mortal, in the temples and fields and city streets, a kind of love was growing, quiet, unspoken, but undeniably present. The love between maker and made, between teacher and student, between those who give and those who receive. It would not last, but while it did, it was beautiful. There is a sound that comes when order begins to fray, not a crash, not a sudden breaking, but a low, persistent hum, the accumulation of small disturbances, each one barely noticeable on its own, but together forming a noise that cannot be ignored, that presses against the silence like water against a dam, relentless and rising. The gods began to hear this sound. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly, a murmur in the distance like wind through reeds. But as the generations of humans passed, as one lifetime gave way to the next and the next and the next, the murmur grew louder. It became a constant presence, a background noise that filled the air even in the darkest hours of night, even in the places that had once been sanctuaries of perfect quiet. The world, which had been so carefully ordered, was becoming loud. Humanity had done exactly what it was made to do. It had multiplied. The first generation had been small, a handful of clay-born beings learning to walk, to work, to live. But they had children, and those children had children. And with each generation, the population grew, spreading from the original cities into new settlements, claiming land that had been empty, building homes where there had been only wilderness. This was not wrong. This was not a violation of divine will. The gods had wanted humanity to thrive, had given them the knowledge and the tools to sustain themselves, to grow, to fill the earth with life. And for a time, that growth had been beautiful. New cities rising along the rivers, new fields greening under the sun, new voices joining the hymns sung in the temples. But somewhere along the way, as something had shifted, the growth had continued, but the rhythm had been lost. The humans no longer moved in harmony with the seasons, no longer paused to rest, to reflect, to maintain the careful balance between work and stillness. They built faster, planted more, traded louder, argued over boundaries and water rights and temple privileges. The quiet reverence that had characterized the Golden Age gave way to something more urgent, more grasping, more desperate. The cities swelled beyond their original walls. Uruk, which had once been a place of order and beauty, became crowded. The streets that had been wide and clean grew narrow with the addition of new buildings, new markets, new workshops. The smell of humanity, sweat and smoke and waste, hung in the air, thick and inescapable. The canals, army which Enki had designed to flow clear and pure, became clogged with refuse. The humans dumped their garbage into the water, their pottery shards and food scraps, and the remains of slaughtered animals. The sacred waterways, which had once reflected the sky like mirrors, turned murky and dark. And everywhere there was noise. The noise was not just sound, it was disruption. It was the breaking of patterns, the severing of the threads that had connected the human world to the divine order. It was children crying at all hours, merchants shouting in the markets, builders hammering and sawing from dawn until long after dark. It was arguments and celebrations and the constant, restless movement of bodies through space. The Sumerians had a word for this, rigmu. It translates poorly into other languages. Some say it means noise or clamour. Others say it means uproar or disturbance. But the word carries a deeper meaning. It refers to the sound of life lived without awareness, without restraint, without consideration for the sacred silence that underlies all existence. Rigmu was the sound of humanity forgetting that they had been made for a purpose, forgetting that the world was a temple, that every action should be undertaken with reverence, that the gods were still present even if they had withdrawn to the high places. The humans were not evil. They had not become corrupt in the way you might imagine corruption, scheming, violent, deliberately cruel. They were simply careless. They were caught up in the momentum of their own lives, in the demands of survival and comfort and ambition. They forgot to be quiet, and they forgot to listen, and the noise they made rose up like smoke, drifting through the air, reaching even the heights of heaven where the gods dwelt. Enlil heard it first. He had always been the most sensitive to disorder, the god most committed to maintaining the structure, the hierarchy, the perfect balance that allowed the cosmos to function. His temple at Nippur was built at the centre of Sumer, the axis around which everything turned, and from that vantage point, he could sense disturbances that the other gods might overlook. At first he tried to ignore it. The faint background hum of human activity was natural, expected. It was the sound of the work being done, of the burden being shared. He reminded himself that this was the solution they had chosen, that humanity's presence was necessary, and that a certain amount of noise was the price of their labour. But the noise did not remain faint. It grew. Day by day, year by year, it swelled until it filled every corner of the world, until there was no escape from it, even in the innermost chambers of his temple, even in the moments when he withdrew to meditate, to align himself with the cosmic order. The noise followed him. It pressed against his thoughts like a physical weight. It disrupted his concentration, made it difficult to hear the subtle harmonies that once guided his decisions. The world, which had been a symphony of carefully balanced elements, was becoming cacophony. Enlil stood on the terrace of the Ekur one evening, looking down at the city of Nippur spread below him. The streets were crowded. Torches burned in every window. The markets were still open even though the sun had set hours ago, merchants haggling over prices, children running between the stalls, dogs barking, donkeys braying. The noise rose up to him in waves, and for the first time in countless ages, Enlil felt something he had never felt before. Anger. Not the righteous anger of a storm destroying what needed to be destroyed, but a deeper, colder anger. Resentment. The sense that he had given humanity everything, had allowed them to exist, had taught them, and guided them and sustained them, and in return they had filled his world with chaos. He turned away from the terrace and descended into the depths of his temple, seeking silence. But even there, even in the stone chambers far below the city, He could still hear it, the faint, persistent hum of Rigmu. I'm the sound of humanity, living without regard for the divine. The other gods noticed the change in Enlil. He became shorter in his responses during the assemblies, less patient with deliberation, more inclined to issue commands rather than seek consensus. His presence, which had once been stern but fair, took on an edge of bitterness. Enki tried to speak with him. They met in the courtyard of the Ekur, under a sky heavy with clouds that had not yet decided whether to release their rain. Enki's manner was gentle, his voice calm. "The humans are thriving," he said. "They are doing the work we made them to do. Is that not what we wanted?" Enlil didn't look at him. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, on the smoke rising from 1,000 cooking fires, on the dust kicked up by 1,000 feet moving through the streets. They are too many," Enlil said quietly. "And they are too loud." Enki considered this. "They are alive. Life is loud. It always has been. Not like this." Enlil's voice hardened. "This is not the sound of life in balance. This is the sound of life out of balance. They have forgotten their place. They have forgotten why they were made." "They are still young," Enki said. "They are still learning. We must be patient." "I have been patient." Enlil turned to face him, and Enki was startled by the intensity in his eyes. "I have watched them multiply. I have watched them spread across the land like weeds. I have listened to their noise day and night, without rest, without reprieve. And I'm telling you, Enki, this cannot continue. What would you have us do?" Enlil didn't answer immediately. He looked back toward the city, his jaw tight, his hands clenched at his sides. "I do not yet know," he said finally, "but something must change." The division among the gods began quietly, like a crack forming in stone. Enki remained the advocate for humanity. He saw their flaws, their carelessness, their noise, but he also saw their potential. He remembered the first human opening their eyes, the wonder and innocence in that gaze. He could not bring himself to condemn them for being exactly what they were made to be. Imperfect, finite, struggling to find their way in a world far larger and more complex than they could fully comprehend. Inanna was torn. She loved humanity's passion, their creativity, their capacity for joy. She delighted in their festivals, their songs, their willingness to celebrate even in the midst of hardship. But she also saw the shadow side of that passion, the jealousy, the violence, the way they turned on each other over petty disputes. She began to spend less time in Uruk, withdrawing to the heights of her temple, uncertain where her loyalties lay. An, the Skyfather, remained distant as always. He did not involve himself in the day-to-day governance of the earth. He listened to the reports from the assembly, nodded thoughtfully, and offered no opinion. The noise of humanity didn't reach him in the same way it reached Enlil. The heavens were still vast and silent, still untouched by the chaos below. But Enlil's anger was growing, and anger, even divine anger, has a way of spreading. The humans, for their part, didn't notice the shift. They continued their lives as they always had, planting and harvesting, building and trading, celebrating and mourning. They brought offerings to the temples, recited the prescribed prayers, performed the rituals that honoured the gods. But the offerings had become routine. The prayers had become rote. The rituals were performed not out of genuine reverence, but out of obligation, out of habit, out of the fear that failing to do so might bring misfortune. The relationship between gods and humans, which had once been intimate and alive, had become transactional. The humans gave offerings, the gods, in theory, gave blessings in return. But the connection, the real, living connection, was fading. The gods were withdrawing. Not all at once, not in a dramatic departure. But slowly, gradually they spent less time walking the streets, less time sitting beside the canals, less time teaching and guiding. They retreated to their temples, to the high chambers of the ziggurats, and the distance between divine and mortal began to widen. The humans felt it, even if they did not understand it. They felt a vague unease, a sense that something had changed, that the world was not quite as safe as it had been. The harvests were still good, the cities were still prosperous, but there was a hollowness beneath the surface, a fragility that had not been there before. The scribes began to record troubling signs: unusual storms, rivers flooding outside their normal seasons, livestock dying without apparent cause, dreams that disturbed the sleep of kings and priests alike, dreams of darkness, of water rising, of voices calling out warnings that could not quite be understood. The tablets filled with these accounts, preserved for future generations who would look back and wonder when exactly the Golden Age had ended. But there was no single moment, only a slow accumulation of distance, of noise, of imbalance. Enlil stopped attending the festivals. The humans noticed his absence, whispered about it in the markets, brought extra offerings to his temple in Nippur, hoping to appease whatever had displeased him. But Enlil did not emerge. He remained in the air-kur, alone, listening to the noise that never stopped, that filled every moment with its relentless presence. He began to dream, not the way humans dream, fragmented, symbolic, confused, but the way gods dream, with intention and clarity. He dreamed of silence, of a world returned to its original state, clean and empty, the noise washed away, the balance restored. He dreamed of water, not the gentle irrigation of the canals, but a great flood, vast and purifying, sweeping across the land, erasing everything that had become corrupt, everything that had drifted too far from the original design. The dream did not horrify him. It calmed him. It offered a solution to the problem that had been growing in his mind, the question that had no answer as long as humanity remained as it was: how to restore silence, how to reclaim the world, how to make things right again. The flood was not yet decided. The assembly had not been called. Enlil had not spoken his intention aloud, but the thought was there, taking root in the deep places of his mind, growing stronger with each passing day, each moment of noise that drove the silence further away. The world continued. The humans built. The fields grew. And the children played in the streets, unaware that high above them, in the temple at Nippur, a god was contemplating their end. Not because they were evil, but because they were loud, because they had forgotten how to be quiet, because the world, in its abundance and its chaos, had drifted too far from the sacred order that had once defined it. The corruption was not in their hearts, it was in the structure itself, in the imbalance between divine intention and earthly reality, in the gap that had opened between what humanity was meant to be and what it had become. And that gap, Enlil believed, could only be closed one way: by beginning again, by washing the slate clean, by allowing the waters to rise and the noise to finally, mercifully stop. The decision had not yet been made, but the seeds had been planted. And in the darkness of the Ikur, where Enlil sat alone, those seeds were beginning to grow. There is a kind of rain that falls not in anger, but in sorrow. Not the sudden violence of a storm, not the cracking thunder and blinding light, but a slow, steady descent, drops that fall one after another in perfect rhythm, accumulating, gathering, rising. Rain that whispers rather than shouts. Rain that arrives not to destroy but to wash clean. This was the rain that came. The assembly gathered in the depths of the Eker. It was night, though time moved differently in that sacred space, in the chamber where the great Anunnaki met to decide the fate of the world. Torches burned along the walls, their flames casting long shadows across the faces of the gods who stood in a circle, silent and solemn. Enlil stood at the centre, His voice when he finally spoke was quiet, not the voice of storm and thunder, but something deeper, something that carried the weight of a decision already made, a course already set. The world has grown too loud, he said. The balance we established has been broken. Humanity, which we created to maintain order, has become the source of chaos. They multiply without restraint. They fill the earth with noise. They have forgotten their purpose, forgotten their place, and I can no longer sustain this. The other gods listened in silence. An, distant as always, his face unreadable. Inanna, her eyes troubled, her hands clasped tightly together. Nisaba, the goddess of writing, who had spent so many patient hours teaching humans to preserve their thoughts in clay. Utu, the sun god, whose light had watched over humanity since their first awakening. And Enki, who had shaped the first humans from clay, who had breathed life into their bodies, who loved them despite their flaws, their noise, their carelessness. "What are you proposing?" Enki asked, though he already knew. Enlil's gaze met his. "A flood." The word hung in the air like a stone dropping into still water. "A flood to cleanse the earth, to wash away what has become corrupt, to return the world to silence, to stillness, to the purity it once knew. And then, perhaps, we can begin again, more carefully this time, with greater restraint." Enki's voice remained calm, but there was an edge beneath it. "You would destroy them all, every human, every child, every scribe and farmer and singer." "Not destroy," Enlil said. "Cleanse. The earth will remain, the rivers will flow, the fields will green again. But the noise, the endless, how unbearable noise will finally cease." The assembly deliberated. Not in arguments, not in raised voices, but in the slow, careful consideration that marked all divine decisions. They weighed the balance. They considered the alternatives. They asked whether there might be another way, a plague perhaps, or a famine, something that would reduce humanity's numbers without erasing them entirely. But Enlil was unmoved. "Half measures will not suffice," he said. "The problem is not their numbers alone. It is what they have become. The only solution is to return to the beginning, to silence, to stillness." One by one the gods consented, not because they wanted this, but because they could see no other path. Because the noise had grown too loud even for them, because the balance had tipped too far, because something somewhere had to give. Even Inanna, who loved humanity's passion, nodded slowly. Even Nisaba, who had taught them to write, to preserve, to remember. Only Enki remained silent, and in his silence, a plan was already forming. The decision was made at night, but the rain didn't come immediately. There was time first, days, perhaps weeks, long enough for Enki to act, to find a way to preserve what Enlil was determined to destroy. He could not defy the assembly openly. The cosmic order did not permit such defiance. But Enki was wise, and wisdom knows how to work within constraints, how to find the spaces between commands, the loopholes in absolute decrees. He chose a human, not a king, not a priest, an ordinary man named Ziusudra, who lived in the city of Shurapak, who tended his fields quietly, who brought offerings to the temple with genuine reverence, who had not forgotten the old ways even as the world around him grew loud and careless. Enki could not speak to him directly. That would be too obvious, too clear a violation of the assembly's decision. So he spoke through a wall. Late one night, when Ziusudra was alone in his home, lying on his sleeping mat, Enki whispered to the reed wall beside him. His voice was soft, barely audible, blending with the rustle of wind through the reeds. "Ziusudra," the wall whispered. The man stirred, uncertain whether he was dreaming. "Ziusudra, listen carefully. A flood is coming. The gods have decided to cleanse the earth, to wash away humanity, and return the world to silence. You cannot stop this, but you can survive it. Ziusudra sat up, his heart racing. Oh, how? Build a boat, the wall whispered. Not a small vessel. A great ark large enough to hold your family, your livestock, the seeds of your fields. Seal it with bitumen. Make it watertight. And when the rain begins, take everything you wish to preserve and go inside. Do not come out until the waters recede. Why me? Ziusudra asked the darkness. The wall was silent for a moment. Then, because you remember, because you have not forgotten what humanity was meant to be, because in you there is still the possibility of balance. The voice faded. Ziusudra sat in the darkness, listening to the normal sounds of the night, crickets, distant dogs, the soft breathing of his wife beside him. And he made his choice. He would build the ark. The construction took weeks. Ziusudra worked quietly, not drawing attention to himself. And he told his neighbours he was building a storehouse, a place to keep grain safe from floods. They nodded, distracted by their own concerns, and thought nothing more of it. He cut timber from the forests upriver. He wove reeds into ropes and mats. He gathered bitumen from the marshes, thick and black and waterproof. He built the ark in the shape Enki had described, rectangular, sturdy, with multiple decks to separate the animals from the supplies from the living quarters. His family helped, though they didn't fully understand why. His wife mixed the bitumen, spreading it across the joints and seams. His sons hauled water and timber. His daughters gathered seeds, barley, wheat, dates, vegetables, storing them in sealed jars, enough to plant when the waters receded. And slowly the ark took shape. It was not beautiful, it was not graceful, but it was strong. It would hold. On the last day before the rain came, Ziusudra led his family inside. They brought the animals, sheep, goats, cattle, chickens, dogs. They brought the seed jars, the tools, the water skins, everything they would need to survive and to begin again. And then Ziusudra sealed the door. The rain began at twilight. Not with thunder, not with lightning. Just rain, soft at first, almost gentle. Drops falling from a sky that had darkened to the colour of slate. The people of Shurapak looked up, mildly annoyed. Rain meant the streets would turn to mud. Rain meant postponing market day. But rain was not unusual. It would pass. Except it did not pass. The rain continued through the night, through the next day, through the day after that. It fell steadily, endlessly, and without pause or variation. The sound became a constant presence, a soft percussion on rooftops, on stone, on water. It filled the air with a kind of white noise that drowned out all other sounds. The rivers began to rise, at first only a little. The Tigris and Euphrates swelled within their banks, the water moving faster, carrying more silt, more debris. The farmers watched nervously, wondering if the canals would hold, if the irrigation channels would overflow. But the rain did not stop, and the rivers kept rising. The water spilled over the banks. It spread across the fields, turning the barley into a strange, submerged forest. It crept into the streets of the cities, ankle deep at first, then knee deep, then waist deep. The people began to panic. They climbed to the upper floors of their homes. They carried their children and their most precious belongings to the rooftops. They called out to the gods, asking what they had done to deserve this, begging for mercy, for the rain to stop. But the gods didn't answer. The rain fell, and the water rose. Inside the ark, Ziusudra and his family listened to the sound of the rain on the roof. It was loud at first, a drumming that seemed to shake the very structure of the boat. But as the days passed, as the ark began to float, lifted gently by the rising waters, the sound changed. It became softer, more rhythmic, almost soothing. They could hear nothing else. No voices, no animals crying out, no sounds of the city, no market calls, no children playing. Only the rain, falling endlessly, and the gentle lapping of water against the hull. It was dark inside the ark. They had brought oil lamps, but they used them sparingly, conserving fuel. Most of the time they sat in the dimness, listening, waiting. There was a strange peace in it. Not joy. They knew what was happening outside, knew that the world they had known was being washed away. But a kind of acceptance, a sense that they were safe, that they had been chosen to survive, that even in the midst of catastrophe there was still the possibility of beginning again. Ziusudra's wife held their youngest child, rocking gently, humming a lullaby that blended with the sound of the rain. The older children sat together, listening to the water, imagining what the world would look like when they finally emerged. The animals slept, lulled by the darkness and the motion of the boat. And outside the rain continued, and the cities disappeared beneath the water. Uruk, with its great ziggurat and its crowded streets, sank slowly beneath the rising tide. The walls that had protected it for generations crumbled as the water undermined their foundations. The temples where the gods had once dwelt filled with silt and darkness. Shuruppak, where Ziusudra had lived, vanished completely. The fields, the canals, the homes where families had laughed and argued and loved, all of it dissolved into the uniform grey of endless water. Nippur, the city of Enlil, stood longer than the others. The Ekur, built on higher ground, remained above the surface for days, its peak visible like a lonely island. But eventually, even it succumbed. The water climbed the steps, entered the chambers, filled the sacred spaces where the assembly had gathered. And then it too, honour was gone. The world became water, endless, uniform, silent. No roads, no boundaries, no cities. Only the rain falling on the surface of a sea that covered everything, that erased every trace of what had been, that returned the earth to something close to its original state. Formless, undifferentiated, waiting. The gods watched from the heavens. Enlil stood alone, his face unreadable. The noise had stopped. The silence he had craved had finally mercifully returned. But there was no satisfaction in it, only a strange, hollow emptiness. Inanna wept. She had not expected to weep. She had consented to the flood, had believed it was necessary. But now, seeing the world drowned, seeing the cities she had loved submerged and silent, she felt the weight of what they had done. "We have killed them," she said quietly. "We have cleansed the earth," Enlil replied, but his voice lacked conviction. An said nothing. He simply watched, distant as always. And Enki looked toward the horizon where somewhere, hidden in the endless expanse of water, a single ark floated. He had saved them. Not all of them, but enough. Enough to begin again. The rain fell for 40 days and 40 nights, or perhaps it was longer. Time became difficult to measure in the unbroken rhythm of falling water. Days blended into one another. The sky remained grey, the water continued to rise. And then slowly, imperceptibly at first, it began to change. The rain lessened, not stopping entirely, but thinning. The drops falling farther apart, the sound softening from a roar to a whisper to a gentle patter. Inside the ark, Ziusudra noticed. He stood, unmoved to the small window near the roof, looked out at the grey sky. The rain was still falling, but lighter now. And in the distance, barely visible through the mist, he thought he saw something. A shape, dark against the grey. A mountain. The waters were receding. Not quickly. It would take weeks, perhaps months, for the land to dry, for the rivers to return to their channels, for the earth to firm beneath their feet again. But the flood was ending. The cleansing was complete. And in the silence that followed, the deep, profound silence of a world washed clean, there was the possibility of something new, something quieter, something more mindful, something that might this time remember. Enlil descended from the heavens. He stood on the peak of the mountain where the ark had come to rest, on the first solid ground to emerge from the receding waters. He watched as Ziusudra opened the door as the family stepped out, blinking in the pale sunlight that broke through the clouds for the first time in months. Enlil had intended to be angry. This human, this survivor, was evidence of Enki's defiance, proof that the cleansing had not been complete. But when he saw Ziusudra's face, weathered, weary, but still carrying a trace of reverence, his anger faded. "You survived," Enlil said. Ziusudra knelt. "The gods willed it." "One god willed it," Enlil corrected. But there was no harshness in his voice, only resignation. He looked out at the water still covering most of the world, slowly draining away. The silence was perfect, complete, everything he had wanted. And yet it felt empty. "Build your altar," Enlil said quietly. "Make your offering, and when the earth is dry, you will plant again. You will have children. You will rebuild. But remember," his voice hardened slightly, "remember what happens when the noise becomes too loud. Remember that the gods are watching. Remember that balance must be maintained." Ziusudra nodded, understanding. He gathered stones, built an altar, made an offering of the few animals he could spare. The smoke rose into the clearing sky, and the gods watching from above smelled it. And they were satisfied. Not because they had destroyed, but because they had preserved. Because in the midst of cleansing, they had allowed for continuity. Because the world, though diminished, could begin again. The rain finally stopped. The sky cleared. The sun returned, pale and gentle, warming the wet earth. And in the silence, the deep, sacred silence that had been bought with so much loss, humanity took its first tentative steps into a new age. Smaller, quieter, humbled, but alive. There is a quality to light after rain that makes everything seem older, softer, more distant. As if the world has been washed not just clean, but back in time, returned to a state of original quietness that had been forgotten, buried beneath layers of noise and dust and careless living. This was the light that greeted Ziusudra and his family when they finally stepped from the ark onto solid ground. The mountain beneath their feet was bare rock, scoured clean by the waters. No grass, no trees, no sign that anything had ever lived here. Just stone, grey and patient, warming slowly under the pale sun. Below them, stretching to the horizon, was mud, endless mud. The flood had receded, but it had left behind a thick layer of silt. Everything the waters had carried, everything they had torn from the cities and fields and forests, I now deposited across the land in a uniform blanket of brown-grey earth. It would take time to dry, weeks, perhaps months. The rivers, once so clearly defined, were now vague channels wandering through the mud, searching for their old courses, remembering slowly where they had flowed before. The world looked empty, not the emptiness of potential, the way it had been before the Anunnaki descended, but the emptiness of aftermath, the silence of a house after guests have left, after the celebration has ended, after the noise has faded and only the evidence remains. Overturned cups, scattered flowers, the faint scent of something that was once alive. Ziusudra stood at the edge of the mountain, looking down at the changed earth, and felt the weight of what had been lost. Not just the cities, though those were gone. Not just the people, and though they were gone too, everyone he had known, everyone he had grown up with, every voice that had filled the markets and temples and streets. But something more abstract, more difficult to name, the closeness, the sense that the gods were near, that they were present, that if you needed them you could simply go to the temple and they might be there, sitting in the courtyard, willing to listen. That feeling was gone. The gods had withdrawn. Not completely. Not yet. But the distance had begun. The first years after the flood were years of silence and slow rebuilding. Ziusudra's family worked with a patience born of necessity. They could not rush. The earth was still too wet, too unstable. They waited for it to dry, for the rivers to settle into their new old channels, waiting for the first green shoots to appear in the mud, volunteers from seeds that had somehow survived, that had been buried deep enough to escape the water's reach. They planted carefully, not in vast fields the way their ancestors had, but in small plots, testing the soil, learning which areas would support growth and which would remain barren. They built a shelter from stones and salvaged timber, simple and functional, nothing like the houses they had known in Shurapak. They did not build a temple. Not at first, there seemed no point. The gods had sent the flood. The gods had destroyed everything. Why would they want offerings now? Why would they listen to prayers? But Ziusudra remembered Enlil's words on the mountain. Build your altar, make your offering. And so he did. A small altar, so just a pile of stones at the highest point near their shelter. He brought offerings when he could, the first barley from their new field, bread made from grain they had saved in the ark, water from the river that was slowly learning to flow clear again. He did not know if the gods accepted these offerings. They did not appear. They did not speak. There was no sign that they had even noticed, but Ziusudra kept bringing them anyway. Because it felt right. Because ritual, even in the absence of response, creates a kind of structure, a way of marking time, of maintaining connection, even when the connection seems impossibly thin. The gods watch from a distance, not from temples. Those were gone, buried beneath the mud. But from the heights of heaven, from the place they had retreated to during the flood, as the place from which they could see the entire world spread below them like a map. Enki was relieved to see the family surviving, adapting, learning. He had saved them precisely because he believed they could do this, could rebuild without constant divine intervention, could remember the old ways while finding new ones. Inanna felt a deep, persistent sadness. She missed the festivals, the dancing, the way humans had looked at her with such joy and wonder. She wanted to descend, to walk among them again, to help them rebuild the temples, to hear their songs. But Enlil had made the new order clear. We will not return as we were, he had said in the assembly after the flood. The old way led to imbalance. Humanity became dependent on us and we became burdened by them. This time, they must learn to stand on their own. We will watch. We will guide from a distance when necessary. But we will not walk among them. We will not live in their cities. The age of direct presence is over. The other gods had agreed, some reluctantly, some with relief. It was time to step back, time to let humanity find its own way. As the generations passed, and they passed quickly now, much faster than they had in the Golden Age, the world slowly regained its colour. The mud dried and cracked, then broke apart, allowing new plants to push through. Grasses first, tough and resilient, then shrubs, then trees, willows along the river banks, date palms in the places where the soil was richest. Ziusudra's children had children. Those children had children. The family became a clan, then a small community, then the seed of a new city. But it was not like the old cities. This one was quieter, smaller, built with more care, more awareness of limits. The people remembered the stories Ziusudra told, stories of the noise, the chaos, the flood that had washed everything away. They remembered the lesson, even if they had not lived through it themselves. Do not become too loud. Do not forget the gods. Do not assume that abundance will last forever. They built a temple, not a massive ziggurat reaching toward the heavens, but a modest structure, low and sturdy, made of brick and wood. Inside, they placed statues of the gods, rough representations, carved by hands that had never seen the gods themselves, that worked only from descriptions passed down through the generations. The statues were placed in niches along the walls, and offerings were left at their feet. Barley, dates, and small clay lamps filled with oil. But the gods did not inhabit these temples the way they once had. The chambers remained empty. The offerings accumulated, then were removed by the priests and distributed to the poor, because someone had to do something with them, and the gods were not coming to partake. The divine presence had become symbolic rather than literal. The gods existed, yes. The people believed in them, prayed to them, honoured them. But they were no longer here, they were somewhere else, somewhere beyond reach, watching but not touching, aware but not involved. It was a lonelier world. The lifespans changed. This was deliberate, a decision made in the divine assembly. Humanity could not be allowed to live as long as they had in the Golden Age, when some individuals had survived for centuries, accumulating power and knowledge and influence until they rivaled the gods themselves. Enlil had been firm on this point. If they live too long, they will forget their mortality. They will forget that they are not divine. They will become loud again, ambitious again, careless again. We must limit them. And so the gods wove a new pattern into human flesh. Where once a human might have lived for 800 years, now they would live for 80. Where once they had centuries to learn, to build, to remember, now they had only decades. The effect was profound. Humans became more urgent. They had less time, so they worked faster, built quicker, made decisions without the luxury of long deliberation, but they also forgot more easily. The old stories, the old ways, began to blur with each passing generation. As Ziusudra's children remembered him vividly, his grandchildren remembered him well. His great-grandchildren knew him only through stories. And by the time his great-great-grandchildren were born, he was already becoming mythic. Not quite real, not quite believable. A figure from a distant past that might not have actually happened the way the stories claimed. The flood itself became a legend. Not something that had truly occurred, but a cautionary tale, a way of teaching children to be mindful, to be quiet, to respect the gods. And with each generation the memory faded a little more. The ziggurats rose again eventually. Not in the same cities. Those were lost, buried under layers of mud and silt that would not be excavated for thousands of years. But in new cities, built by new generations who felt the pull of the old patterns, or who wanted to reach toward the heavens the way their ancestors had. They built carefully, reverently, hoping that if they made the temples beautiful enough, sacred enough, the gods might return. But the gods did not return. They watched from the heights, from the temples that existed in heaven rather than earth. They saw the humans building, planting, celebrating, mourning. They saw the rituals being performed, the offerings being made, the prayers being whispered into the darkness. And they were moved by it, not enough to descend, not enough to walk the streets again, to sit beside the canals, to teach the farmers how to read the soil, but enough to maintain a connection, thin and fragile as it was. They sent signs occasionally, a dream to a king, showing him where to dig a canal, a vision to a priestess, revealing the proper way to perform a ritual, small interventions, barely noticeable, but enough to let humanity know they were still there, still watching, still caring in their distant way. But the age of direct presence was over. Humanity was on its own now. There was a melancholy to this new age that had not existed before. The golden age had been joyful, abundant, safe. The age of noise had been chaotic, overwhelming, unsustainable. But this new age, the age after the flood, was something else entirely. It was the age of memory and loss, the age of looking back at what had been, and knowing it could never return. The age of ruins half buried in mud, of stories that might not be true, of gods who were present only in absence. The humans felt it in their bones, a sense that something important had been lost, that the world was smaller now, quieter, less full of meaning. They built their cities and tended their fields and raised their children, but there was always an undertone of nostalgia, a longing for something they had never personally experienced, but which lived in their collective memory like a phantom limb. They wrote about it sometimes. The scribes trained in the art Nisaba had once taught, pressed their styluses into clay and recorded the old stories. They wrote about the time when the gods walked among humans. They wrote about the flood, about Ziusudra and his ark, about the noise that had angered Enlil. They wrote king lists that stretched back to before the flood, when rulers reigned for thousands of years, and the world was different in ways that were hard to explain. And they ended these texts with a phrase that appeared again and again, a refrain that captured the feeling of the age. After the flood, kingship descended from heaven once more, but it was not as it had been. Nothing was as it had been. Enki descended one last time, not to walk the streets, not to teach, but to visit the temple in Eridu, the city that had been his, the place where he had first shaped humans from clay. The new Eridu was built near the site of the old one, though the people did not know that. They simply knew this was a sacred place, that something important had happened here once, that building here felt right in a way they could not articulate. Enki stood in the empty temple, in the chamber where his statue resided, and looked at the offerings accumulated at its feet. Barley, dates, all small clay figurines made by children. He felt a tenderness toward these offerings that surprised him. They were so small, so humble, made by people who had never seen him, who did not know what he truly looked like, who believed in him anyway, who brought what little they had and left it here hoping he would notice. He noticed. He could not stay. The decision had been made, the new order established. But he could offer this much, a presence brief and subtle, a warmth in the air that the priests might feel when they entered the temple the next morning, a sense that their offerings had been received, that they were not forgotten. Enki touched the statue's hand, leaving a trace of his essence there, and then he withdrew, ascending back to the heavens, leaving behind a world that would continue without him, a world that would remember, even as it forgot, a world that would long for the gods, even as it learned to live without them. The sun set over the new cities, casting long shadows across the ziggurats. The fields lay quiet in the evening light, the barley swaying gently in a breeze that carried no voices, only the whisper of plants and the distant call of birds returning to their nests. In the temple courtyards, the priests lit the evening lamps, performing rituals that had been performed for generations, that would be performed for generations to come, whether or not the gods were present to receive them. And in the heavens, the Anunnaki watched, silent, distant, fading slowly into myth, but not gone. Not entirely. Still there, still aware, still holding a thread of connection to the world they had made, as the humans they had shaped, the balance they had tried so hard to maintain. The world was quieter now, older, sadder, but still turning, still green with life, still carrying forward the patterns that had been established in the beginning. Before the noise, before the flood, before the gods decided that love sometimes means letting go. There is a way that important things end, not with declarations, not with ceremonies, but simply by ceasing to continue. A conversation that trails off into silence. A path that is walked less and less frequently until the grass grows over it. A presence that becomes rarer, more intermittent, until one day you realise it's been years since you last felt it, and you cannot remember exactly when it stopped. This is how the Anunnaki left. Not in a single moment, not in a grand exodus that humanity could witness and remember and mark in their calendars, but gradually, imperceptibly, like mist burning off in morning sunlight, like footprints fading from sand. One day, they were still there, distant, yes, but present in some sense, still watching from the heights, still sending the occasional dream or vision. I'm still maintaining that thin thread of connection. And then slowly, they were not. The last festivals were the quietest. The priests still performed the rituals, still sang the ancient hymns in the temple courtyards, still placed offerings before the statues of the gods. But there was a perfunctory quality to it now, a sense that they were going through motions whose meaning had been lost, whose original purpose had faded into history. The younger priests had never known the gods as anything but stories. They learned the hymns because their teachers taught them. They made the offerings because that was what priests did. But they did not expect the gods to appear. They did not wait, listening for footsteps, on the temple stairs for a voice calling from the high chamber. The gods had become literature, beautiful literature, certainly, sacred literature, stories that carried weight and meaning and shaped how people understood the world, but literature nonetheless, words on clay, images in stone, memories preserved but no longer living. The older priests felt the difference more acutely. They remembered when the rituals had felt inhabited, when speaking the gods' names had created a kind of presence in the air, a thickening of reality, a sense that something beyond the physical was paying attention. Now the names were just sounds. The rituals were just movements. They performed them anyway, with quiet devotion, because that was all they knew how to do. But in their hearts they understood that something had ended. Inanna was the last to leave. She had always been the most reluctant, the most attached to humanity, had the most drawn to the noise and colour and passion of mortal life. Long after the other gods had withdrawn completely, she still descended occasionally, not to the cities but to the wild places, the hilltops and river bends, where humans rarely went. She stood on a hill overlooking Uruk one evening, the city that had once been hers, where she had danced in the streets and taught humans to celebrate, to love, to fight. It looked small from here. The ziggurat still rose at its centre, but it seemed diminished, worn by weather and time. The streets that had once been crowded were quieter now. The population had never recovered to what it was before the flood. The people moved more carefully, more cautiously, carrying the inherited memory of loss, even if they did not fully understand it. Inanna felt a profound sadness settling over her, not regret exactly. She did not regret the flood. It had been necessary. The balance had needed to be restored. But she mourned what had been lost in the restoration, the closeness, the intimacy, the sense that gods and humans were partners in the work of sustaining the world. That partnership was over. Humanity would continue without them, was already continuing without them. Building, planting, writing, remembering. Creating their own stories now, stories in which the gods were background rather than characters, distant forces rather than companions. It was right, perhaps, necessary. But it was also a kind of death. Inanna closed her eyes, breathed in the scent of the earth, dust and river water and growing things. She wanted to remember this, to carry it with her into whatever came next. And then, without ceremony, without farewell, she simply released her hold on the temple in Uruk, on the statues carved in her image, on the hymns sung in her name, on the city itself, the people who lived there, the world she had loved so fiercely. She released it all, and when she opened her eyes again, she was no longer standing on the hill. She was somewhere else, somewhere that had no location, that existed outside the geography of Earth, the place where the gods had retreated, the realm that was not heaven in the way humans imagined it, but simply elsewhere. Below her, far below, the earth continued. Small, beautiful, turning slowly beneath its blanket of clouds, and on its surface, invisible from this distance, humanity was learning to be alone. The tablets were buried deliberately, not all of them, but the ones used for daily records, inventories, contracts, letters, were kept in the temples and palaces, stored in libraries, consulted when needed. But the oldest tablets, the ones that recorded the deepest knowledge, the sacred patterns the gods had taught in the beginning, those were taken to secret places. The priests wrapped them in cloth, placed them in clay jars, sealed the jars with bitumen. They carried them into caves, into the foundations of ancient temples, into places that would be forgotten, that would remain hidden until some distant future when humanity might be ready to remember. They did this because they sensed, without being told, that an age was ending, that the direct transmission of knowledge from divine to mortal was ceasing, and what remained needed to be preserved in physical form, made protected from time and decay and the carelessness of future generations who would not understand what they possessed. The tablets contained everything: the creation stories, how the sky lifted from the earth, how the waters were divided, how humans were shaped from clay. The king list that stretched back before the flood, the hymns to the Anunnaki, the instructions for rituals, for building temples, for maintaining the cosmic order. The me, the divine patterns, the sacred knowledge that had been gifted to humanity in the Golden Age. All of it pressed into clay, preserved, buried, entrusted to the earth itself for safekeeping. The priests who buried these tablets did not expect to see them again in their lifetimes. Perhaps they did not expect anyone to see them again, but they buried them anyway, driven by an instinct deeper than reason, a sense that even if the gods were gone, even if the connection was severed, the knowledge should survive, that someday, somehow, it might matter again. In the heavens, the Anunnaki gathered one last time, not in assembly, not in deliberation. There were no decisions left to make. The course had been set, the new order established. This gathering was simply acknowledgement, bearing witness to an ending. An stood at the centre, as he always had, vast and distant and silent. Around him the other gods, Enlil, Enki, Inanna, Nisaba, Utu, all the countless others whose names humanity had spoken, whose stories had been told, whose presence had once filled the world. They did not speak. What was there to say? They had done what they came to do. They had separated heaven from earth, uncarved the rivers, shaped humanity, taught civilization, watched it flourish and fail and begin again. They had given everything they could give, and now it was time to withdraw completely. Not because they were tired, though some of them were, not because they had failed, though in some ways they had, but because the natural order of things required it. Because creation, once begun, must eventually be released. Because children, even cosmic children, must be allowed to grow up. Enki looked down at the earth one last time. He could see the cities, small clusters of light in the darkness. He could see the fields, geometric patterns imposed on the land. He could see the rivers flowing, the same rivers he had carved with his own hands countless ages ago, still finding their way to the sea. And somewhere down there, too small to see, too brief to matter in cosmic terms, but mattering nonetheless, humans were living their lives, waking at dawn, working in the fields, telling stories to their children, making love, growing old, dying, being born, the cycle continuing without divine intervention, without guidance, without the presence of the Anunnaki. It was working, not perfectly. It never would be perfect. But it was working well enough. Humanity would survive, would adapt, would find its own way forward. Enki felt a swell of pride, and beneath it, an ache of loss. He had loved them, perhaps more than he should have, perhaps more than was wise for a god, but he had loved them, and now he was letting them go. The departure was not visible to human eyes. There were no ships ascending into the sky, no pillars of light. No thunder or earthquakes or signs that anything had changed. The world simply continued as it had, the sun rising and setting, the seasons turning, the rivers flowing. But in the temples, in the quiet moments between rituals, the priests began to sense something, an absence where there had once been presence, a hollowness in the air when they spoke the gods' names, a sense that the prayers they offered were no longer being received, that they were speaking into a void that did not answer back. At first they dismissed this feeling. The gods were distant, yes, but they had been distant for generations. This was nothing new. But as the years passed, the feeling deepened, the dream stopped, the visions ceased, the small signs that had once reassured them. The flickering of a lamp at a significant moment, or the unexpected rain that saved a failing harvest, no longer came. The gods, it seemed, were truly gone. Some of the priests wept when they realised this. Others felt relieved. The burden of maintaining connection to beings who barely responded had been exhausting. A few refused to believe it, insisting that the gods were simply testing their faith, that if they continued the rituals faithfully enough, the presence would return. But deep in their hearts, even the most faithful knew. The Anunnaki had left. Earth belonged to humanity now. Completely. Finally. Irrevocably. The ruins began to accumulate. Not immediately. The cities continued to function. The temples continued to be maintained. But without divine presence animating them, they slowly became monuments rather than living spaces. The ziggurat stood empty. The high chambers where the gods had once rested remained unused, gathering dust, their walls cracking as rain seeped through damaged roofs. The statues of the gods stood in their niches, eyes blank, mouths silent, bodies slowly eroding under the patient work of time. Gradually, the cities themselves began to shift. Some were abandoned entirely, their populations moving elsewhere, seeking better land, better water, better fortune. The buildings left behind crumbled, their mud brick walls dissolving back into earth, their wooden beams rotting, their roofs collapsing. Sand began to cover what rain and wind had broken. Within a few generations, some of the oldest cities were buried completely. The places where the gods had walked, them where the first humans had learned to plant and write and celebrate, all of it disappeared beneath the accumulated layers of time. But the tablets remained, hidden in their jars, sealed in their caves, buried in the foundations of forgotten temples. Waiting. Patient as only clay can be patient. Content to lie in darkness for centuries or millennia, until the time came for them to be found again. They carried the only proof that the Anunnaki had existed. Not the ruins. Ruins could be explained in many ways, built by many hands. But the tablets with their wedge-shaped marks, their meticulous records, their stories of gods who had names and personalities and purposes. The tablets remembered, even when humanity forgot. In the realm beyond Earth, the Anunnaki settled into their new existence. It was not emptiness, it was not death, but it was profoundly different from what had come before. They no longer had form in the way they once had. No bodies to move through space, no hands to shape clay, no voices to speak words that mortals could hear. They existed now as pure consciousness, as awareness without vessel, watching without eyes, knowing without thought. The Earth was still visible to them, in a way, not as an object in space, but as a pattern, a living system, a complexity that they had helped create and could still perceive. They watched humanity evolve, watched empires rise and fall, watched languages change, religions transform, knowledge accumulate and disperse, watched humans forget the Anunnaki entirely, then rediscover them millennia later when archaeologists unearthed the tablets, translated the texts, who puzzled over the strange stories of gods who had once walked among mortals. The Anunnaki did not intervene, could not intervene perhaps, or chose not to. The distinction was unclear, and perhaps it did not matter. They had given humanity everything they could give. The rest was up to those small, fragile, impossibly persistent beings who still lived in the land between two rivers, who still planted barley and built cities and told stories, even if they no longer knew the original stories, even if they had to invent their history anew with each generation. Humanity was alone now, and in that aloneness, something remarkable was emerging. Not the perfection the gods had once envisioned, not the orderly, quiet, reverent civilization of the Golden Age, but something more complex, more interesting, more fully alive, where humanity was becoming itself. The last light faded from the temples, not the physical light. That would continue as long as priests tended lamps, as long as sun shone through windows. But the other light, the subtle luminescence that had once indicated divine presence, the glow that sensitive souls could perceive when the gods were near. That light went out, and the world became, in some essential way, darker. Not with evil, not with corruption, but with absence. The absence of the divine walking among the mortal, the absence of guidance from beyond, the absence of the certainty that someone, somewhere was watching, caring, maintaining the patterns that kept chaos at bay. Humanity would learn to create its own light, its own meaning, its own patterns, its own stories to explain the cosmos and its place within it. But for now, in this moment of transition, there was only the darkness and the quiet and the slow realization that the gods who had made them, who had taught them, who had both blessed and burdened them with existence, were gone. On a hill overlooking what had once been Eridu, now buried beneath sand and time, a shepherd sat watching his flock. He did not know this place had been sacred, did not know that beneath his feet lay the foundations of the first temple, the place where Enki had dwelt, where the first humans had learned to speak and write and dream. He knew only that his sheep were safe, that the grass was adequate, that the evening was peaceful. He looked up at the stars emerging in the darkening sky. His grandfather had told him their names once, not the names humans use, but older names, strange names that felt like prayers. He could not remember them now, only that they had once meant something, that the sky itself had once been alive with meaning, with presence, with gods who had names and faces and walked the earth. But that was long ago, if it had ever been true at all. The shepherd lay back against the hillside, watching the stars multiply, listening to the soft sounds of his sheep settling for the night. And beneath him, buried deep in the earth, the tablets waited, silent, patient, remembering. There is a sound that continues long after its source has ceased. The note of a bell, still vibrating in air, still shaping silence into something that can be felt, if not quite heard. The ripples spreading across water after the stone has sunk, after the thrower has walked away, after even the memory of the throw has faded. This is what the Anunnaki left behind. Not their presence, not their voices, but an echo, faint, persistent, woven so deeply into the fabric of human consciousness that it cannot be entirely erased, even by millennia of forgetting, even by the slow erosion of sand and time. The cities rose again, as cities always do. Babylon emerged where Sumer had been, speaking a different language, worshipping gods with different names. The Babylonians knew the old stories, but they had changed them, adapted them, made them their own. Marduk became the chief god, replacing Enlil in the cosmic hierarchy. The creation story was retold, not the separation of heaven and earth, but a battle between Marduk and Tiamat. Order defeating chaos, the world formed from the body of the conquered. The violence was new. The Sumerians had not imagined creation as conquest, but the Babylonians lived in a more violent age, and their stories reflected that. Still, beneath the new narratives, the old patterns remained. The ziggurat still rose toward heaven. The priests still performed rituals descended from Sumerian originals, even if they no longer remembered why. The tablets still circulated, copied and recopied, the wedge-shaped marks pressed into fresh clay by scribes who were preserving something they did not fully understand. The echo growing fainter, but still audible. Assyria came after Babylon, harder, more martial, more concerned with empire than with cosmic balance. The Assyrian kings built vast libraries, collecting tablets from across their conquered territories. They wanted to preserve knowledge, though their reasons were more political than spiritual. Knowledge meant power, the ability to read the old texts, to understand the ancient rituals, to claim connection to the deep past. All of this legitimized their rule. In the library at Nineveh, thousands of tablets were gathered, copies of the Enuma Elish, the creation epic, copies of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the story of the king who sought immortality and failed to find it, copies of hymns to gods whose temples no longer stood, whose names were already becoming obscure. And among these texts, fragments of something older, references to the Anunnaki, descriptions of the time before the flood, when humans lived for centuries and the gods walked openly. Lists of the me, the divine patterns that had once been taught directly, but now survived only as words on clay. The Assyrian scribes copied these fragments faithfully, not understanding their full significance, not knowing they were preserving the last clear memories of a time when earth and heaven had not been so far apart. The library burned eventually, as libraries do. Invaders came, the palace collapsed. Fire consumed the wooden shelves, the reed mats, the fabric wrappings. But the tablets themselves, baked hard by the flames, survived. They fell into the ruins, were buried beneath the rubble, and waited. As they had always waited, as they were made to wait. As the centuries passed, Babylon fell, Assyria fell, Persia came and went. Alexander brought Greek thought, Greek gods, Greek ways of understanding the cosmos that had nothing to do with the old Sumerian patterns. The ziggurats crumbled, the temples were abandoned, the languages shifted, evolved, disappeared. Akkadian gave way to Aramaic, Aramaic gave way to Arabic. The wedge-shaped script became unreadable, a curiosity, decorative marks on ancient bricks that no one could interpret. The names were forgotten. An, Enlil, Enki, Inanna. Gone from human speech, preserved only in the buried tablets, waiting in darkness for someone to remember how to read them. The echo was almost inaudible now, but still there, still present in the deep structure of stories, in the archetypes that persisted. The flood, but the wise God who defies the angry God to save humanity, the divine knowledge passed to mortals, the sense that the world had once been different, more magical, more directly touched by the sacred. These patterns appeared again and again in the myths of cultures that had never heard of Sumer, that knew nothing of the Anunnaki. As if the echo had spread beyond its source, rippling outward across time and space, touching every human story, every attempt to understand where we came from and why we are here. Sand covered the ruins. Slowly, grain by grain, the deserts reclaimed what had once been cities. The wind carried dust from the plateaus, deposited it across the plains, year after year, century after century. The land that had been green became brown, then beige, then the pale gold of endless sand. Beneath that sand, invisible, had forgotten the shapes of temples remained. The ziggurats reduced to low mounds, barely distinguishable from natural hills. The walls of palaces and homes dissolved back into earth. The streets where merchants had shouted and children had played filled with sediment, becoming indistinguishable from the surrounding desert. But deeper still, in the places where sand could not penetrate, the tablets endured, sealed in their jars, protected by the bitumen that had been applied with such care by priests who knew somehow that this knowledge needed to survive. The clay was patient. It did not decay, It did not dissolve, it simply waited, holding its patterns, its wedge-shaped memories, its echo of voices that had ceased to speak millennia ago. The stars turned overhead, unchanged. The same stars the Sumerians had watched, had named, had woven into their understanding of divine order. The same constellations, though the names had changed, though the stories told about them bore little resemblance to the originals. But the stars themselves, constant, patient, eternal, remained. Then, after more than 2,000 years of forgetting, someone remembered, not all at once, not in a sudden revelation, but slowly, painstakingly, through the work of scholars who learned to read the ancient script, who excavated the buried cities, who pieced together the fragments. They found Nineveh beneath its tell. They found Babylon beneath its layers of occupation. They found Uruk, Eridu, cities that had been lost so completely that their very existence had passed into myth. And they found the tablets, thousands of them, tens of thousands, each one a fragment of the vast library of human memory, of the accumulated knowledge of civilizations that had risen and fallen and been forgotten. The scholars cleaned the tablets, catalogued them, began the slow work of translation, and as they read, they encountered names that had not been spoken in millennia. Anunnaki, the great gods, the ones who had descended from heaven, the ones who had shaped humanity and taught civilization, and then, for reasons the texts did not fully explain, had departed. The scholars debated what these stories meant. Were they myths, metaphors, distorted memories of real events, evidence of ancient astronauts as some claimed, or simply the way pre-literate peoples made sense of their world, of their own origins, of the forces they could not control? The debates continued. The theories multiplied. But beneath all the interpretation, beneath all the analysis, the texts themselves remained, patient, clear, speaking in their own voices about a time when the world had been different, when the gods had been present, when humanity had not been alone. In the present moment, in the time you inhabit now, the echo is still perceptible. Not in the obvious ways, not in temples or rituals or prayers directed to Sumerian gods, but in the deeper currents of human thought, in the persistent questions that every generation asks. Where did we come from? Why are we here? Are we alone? These questions, which seem so modern, so unique to our time, are the same questions the Sumerians asked. The same questions that led them to imagine the Anunnaki, to create stories of gods who descended to Earth, who shaped humans with care and purpose, who taught and guided and then departed. The echo lives in every story of divine contact, of knowledge passed from higher beings to humanity, of a golden age that existed once and was lost. It lives in the persistent sense that we are meant for something more, that we carry within us a spark of the divine, a fragment of consciousness that connects us to something vast and ancient and only dimly remembered. The Sumerians called this spark the blood of the gods, mixed into the clay from which humans were formed. We might call it consciousness, awareness, the capacity for wonder. But the essence is the same. We are not merely matter. We are matter infused with something else, something that came from beyond, something that makes us capable of asking questions that have no answers, kind of seeking meaning in a universe that offers none directly. This is the gift the Anunnaki left behind, not their presence, not their guidance, but their absence. The space they created when they departed, the void that humanity has spent thousands of years trying to fill with philosophy, religion, science, art. The echo that drives us to build, to explore, to reach always upward toward the stars, seeking connection with something greater than ourselves. The night is very quiet now. The stars above you are the same stars that shone over Sumer, over Babylon, over Assyria. The same stars that witnessed the golden age, the flood, the slow fading of divine presence from the earth, They have watched empires rise and fall. They have watched languages born and die. They have watched humanity forget the Anunnaki entirely, then rediscover them in fragments of clay pulled from beneath millennia of sand. And they will continue watching, patient and distant, long after our own civilization has passed into memory, long after our languages have been forgotten, long after our cities have crumbled and been covered by whatever substance time chooses to use. The stars do not change, but beneath them, everything changes. Cities become sand. Sand becomes cities. Knowledge is lost, then found, then lost again. Stories transform, evolve, adapt, carrying within them the faintest echo of something that was once known clearly, but has now become obscure, mysterious, subject to endless interpretation. The Anunnaki are gone, or perhaps they were never there in the way the stories claim. Perhaps they were metaphor from the beginning, and a way of expressing something true about human origins, about our relationship to the cosmos, about the sense that we are both of the earth and somehow beyond it. It does not matter. What matters is the echo, the persistent memory, carried in clay and story, and the deep structures of human imagination, that we were once not alone, that we were shaped with intention, that we belong to something larger than ourselves. This memory comforts us, even in its ambiguity. It suggests that our presence here is not accident, not random collision of atoms, but part of a pattern, a purpose, a design that connects us to the ancient past and the distant future. The wind moves across the desert, carrying sand, always carrying sand. Beneath the surface, the tablets wait. Some have been found, some remain buried, and are holding stories no living human has read, preserving knowledge that may never be recovered. But the clay is patient. It does not require discovery. It does not need validation. It simply is, holding its patterns, its memories, its echo of voices that spoke when the world was young, and the gods walked openly, and humanity was just beginning to understand what it meant to be human. The rivers still flow, though their courses have changed. The Tigris, the Euphrates, still moving toward the sea, still carrying silt, still shaping the land as they have for countless millennia. The land between the rivers, Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, where writing began, where cities rose, where humans first learned to preserve their thoughts beyond the span of a single lifetime, where the Anunnaki, whether real or imagined, or whether divine or metaphorical, left their mark so deeply that we are still, thousands of years later, trying to decipher it. Your breathing has slowed. The story has carried you far from where you began, through ages and empires, through floods and departures, through the long, slow process of forgetting and the careful work of remembering. But now the story is fading, not ending. Stories like this do not end. They simply continue beyond the reach of words, into the realm of sleep and dream, where meaning exists without language, where the echo of the Anunnaki lives not in tablets or translations, but in the deep currents of unconscious knowing. The gods are gone, but the spark remains, in you, in every human who has ever wondered at the stars, who has ever felt the pull of something ancient, who has ever sensed that this world, for all its solidity, is somehow transparent, a veil over deeper realities that we can almost, but not quite, perceive. The Anunnaki left, but they did not leave us empty. They left us the echo, and the echo is enough. The stars turn, the sand settles, the rivers flow. And in the darkness, in the space between waking and sleeping, between remembering and forgetting, the echo continues. Faint, persistent, eternal. Sleep now. The ancient world is watching over you. The gods, whether present or absent, whether real or imagined, are holding space. The tablets are waiting in the earth. The stars are constant above. And you, You're exactly where you need to be. Safe, quiet, held by the same patterns that shaped the first humans from clay, breathing the same air that moved across Sumer. I'm part of the same story that began when heaven separated from earth and will continue long after the last word has been spoken. Rest. The echo will carry you.